20 years on the farm had taught him to read the earth with his fingertips, and when he squeezed that clump, he realized he wasn't holding soil, but compressed poison with a taste of a battery. Dead. No worms, no roots. And then green letters flashed in the air. The terraforming system is activated. Dan Holt opens his eyes, and the first thing he feels is the taste of earth on his lips, bitter like a battery, glass grinding against his teeth. Above him, a sky the color of old lead, low, heavy, without a single glimmer of light. He lies face down on a black, cracked surface and simply breathes for 3 seconds. The air reeks of rusty iron and chemicals. That's how it smelled at the battery dump outside his town in Oregon. Only here, the stench is everywhere. Dan sits up. His head is spinning. His hands are shaking. He looks around and sees nothing familiar. No road, no tractor, no barn. Black grass stretches to the horizon. Not dead, just black. Alive, but wrong. Thorns the color of dried blood stick out between the tufts, some as long as his forearm. And right here, his body takes over from fear. 20 years on the farm, he mechanically crumbles a clump of earth between his fingers and understands everything. The structure is dead. No worms, no roots. Compressed poison with a sour aftertaste. He brings his fingers to his nose, and the panel unfolds right in front of his face. Green letters glow softly and clearly. Soil analysis. Mana-toxin concentration 87%. Hydrogen index 3.1. Organic matter 0.4%. Available energy 12 units. Dan blinks. He reaches out his hand. His fingers pass right through the letters. He looks at his palms, the same calluses, the same scar from old barbed wire. It's him. Just not in Oregon. And the last thing he remembers is the crunch of his own ribs under the tractor. He must be dead. But the dead don't taste a battery on their tongue. Dan stands up. His knees are shaking, but holding him up. He turns around. To the south, a black plain. To the east, the same. The west is the same. And to the north, beyond a strip of thorns, he makes out a wooden palisade. Thin plumes of smoke. Buildings. People. Which means water, food, and answers. He takes his first step, and a thorn crunches under his foot like glass. A thick, dark sap oozes from the shard. The system flares up. Toxic exudate. Do not touch with bare skin. Dan steps over the puddle and heads north. Black grass clings to his ankles. He has to go around the thorns. The air thickens with every 100 steps, as if he's entering an invisible cloud. The system flashes. Area of elevated toxin concentration. Reduce exposure time. Dan coughs. His throat burns. He picks up his pace. An hour later, a palisade rises before him. The logs are gray with age. Rusty strips of iron protrude between them. A figure stirs in the watchtower. Dan raises his hand and waves. The figure freezes, disappears. The gate swings open. A man with a crossbow steps out. Behind him are 2 men with spears. They look at Dan as if he were a ghost. The man shouts something, a foreign language, unfamiliar. And then a switch flips in his head, and the words make sense. He asks who you are and how you made it through the scar alive. Dan opens his mouth and finds himself answering in the same language. The words come out on their own. He says he doesn't know how he ended up here, that he woke up on black earth, that he needs water. The spearman spits. No one comes back alive from the scar. The last one who tried, 14 years ago, returned as nothing but a boot, with a foot still inside. The crossbowman lowers his weapon, but not all the way. You can come in. But if you're a creature that's taken human form, we'll burn you." Dan says he's not a creature, that he's a farmer. The spearman snorts. Farmers don't survive on shroom. Dan is silent. They lead him inside. The village is called Iron Hill. 36 houses made of gray stone and dark wood. One street. A muddy, rutted path from the gate to the well. People peer out from their doors. Gaunt faces, wary eyes. Children hide behind their mothers. 100 people, maybe fewer. They lead him to a larger house. An old man with a thick beard and a stern gaze opens the door. The village elder, Garrick. He eyes Dan from head to toe and asks the same questions. Where from? How he survived? Why he came? Dan repeats himself. "I don't know where from. I woke up on Black Earth. I need shelter." Garrick is silent for a long time. Then he says there's no extra food in Iron Hill. Winter is coming. Every mouth is a burden. But sending a man back to Scar means killing him. And they don't keep murderers here. He turns to a woman in the back of the room. Evelyn, the herbalist. Let him stay with her. The hayloft has been empty since her husband died. The woman steps out of the shadows, about 35 years old, dark hair tied in a bun, hands cracked from herbs, eyes calm and attentive. She looks at Dan, not with pity, not with suspicion, something in between. She nods. Let's go. On the way, Dan takes in the village with his eyes. The vegetable gardens are pitiful. The cabbage is small with yellow leaves. Carrots stick out with twisted tails. Onions the size of walnuts. The soil looks acidic even at a glance, gray with reddish spots. At every fence, the system spits out lines. pH 4.2, potassium deficiency, phosphorus deficiency, excess aluminum, root suppression, liming, composting, mulching. But he sees all this even without the system, by the color of the leaves, by the twisted stems, by the water standing in the furrows, not being absorbed. The land here isn't cursed, it's neglected. Evelyn leads him to a stone cottage with a front garden where something dry and sad is sticking out, dead stems between the stones. There used to be a garden here, a nice garden. Dan can tell that from the remains of the garden beds. Someone who knew a thing or two about plants laid them out, and then abandoned them. Evelyn points to the hayloft. Clean, dry. An old blanket and a straw mattress. Dan sits down and only now realizes how exhausted he is. Evelyn brings a mug of something hot, herbal tea, bitter but warming. She sits by the door and asks if he's really a farmer. Dan says yes. What he used to grow. Apples, goats, a little wheat, tomatoes in the winter. Evelyn raises an eyebrow at the word tomatoes. They don't know them here. She says the last good harvest was 6 years ago. The land is giving out. The young people are leaving for the cities. In 10 years, only the old folks will be left here. Dan finishes his tea. He looks out the window at the pitiful vegetable garden, then at his own hands. The calluses are still there. The system flickers at the edge of his vision, ready to go. He says he wants to check out the community garden first thing tomorrow morning. Evelyn shrugs. There's nothing to see there. Dan lies down and closes his eyes. A panel hangs before his inner gaze. 12 units of energy. Organic matter 0.4%. The numbers are grim, but numbers are just numbers. He's seen worse soil. In Oregon, there was a plot next to an old gas station. Everyone swore nothing would grow there. 3 years later, sunflowers were blooming there. Dan falls asleep with one thought. Tomorrow, he has to find some ash. Mornings in Iron Hill started early. Dan woke up to the sound of an axe. Someone was chopping wood behind the wall. A gray light filtered through the cracks in the hayloft. Not sunlight. The sun must be a rarity here. He went downstairs and found Evelyn in the yard. She was standing by a log, sorting through bundles of dry herbs. Some roots were drying on a rope nearby. Dan said hello. She nodded and said the porridge was on the stove. The porridge was gray and tasteless. The grain had clearly grown on poor soil. Dan chewed and thought. Then he washed his bowl and said he was going to check the garden. Evelyn gave him a strange look, but said nothing. The communal garden was located behind the square with the well. The plot was about half the size of a tennis court. Dan stopped at the edge and just stood there for the first 2 minutes. That's how he'd been taught back on the farm. Don't touch it until you've looked. The soil was gray with reddish streaks, typical acidic soil with an excess of iron. Cabbages grew in rows, but each head was no bigger than a fist. The leaves were pale with yellow edges. Classic starvation. The carrots weren't even worth pulling up. The tops were thin and reddish. That meant the root below was woody and bitter. The system unfolded before his eyes. pH 4.3. Aluminum 3 times above normal. Potassium almost at 0. Phosphorus blocked by acidity. The microbiome is suppressed by 80%. Dan crouched down. He picked up a clump of soil. He crumbled it between his fingers. He sniffed it. Then he did what the whole village would later discuss for 3 days. He licked the soil. He didn't bite off a piece. He didn't eat it. He just touched it with the tip of his tongue. It's an old farmer's trick. You can determine acidity by taste better than any instrument. Sour, very sour, with a metallic aftertaste. Behind him, someone gasped. Dan turned around. About 10 people were standing by the fence. Old women, children, a couple of men. Everyone was looking at him as if he were crazy. Garrick was standing among them. His face didn't look good. Standing next to Garrick was a large man with hands like a blacksmith's. That was the blacksmith. Bran. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at Dan with an expression Dan knew well from his neighbors in Oregon. Outsider. City slicker. Not one of us. Dan stood up. He brushed off his knees. He looked at the crowd. Then he looked at the tree growing in the corner of the garden. An ash tree. Old and sturdy. The only healthy plant on the entire plot. Dan pointed to it and said that the roots of this tree made the soil around it less acidic. That if they took the ashes from the campfires and scattered them over the garden bed, it would be even better. That he needed 3 buckets of sand from the river, 2 baskets of rotted goat manure, and a week's time. Not for the whole garden, for one garden bed. This one, for Grandma Martha. He pointed to an old woman in the crowd. He didn't know her name. Evelyn whispered it to him. Martha stood hunched over, leaning on a cane. Her joints were swollen. Her fingers were gnarled. Dan said Martha's joints hurt and she needed cabbage with less bitterness and more nutrients. That he could do that. Garrick asked why he needed just 1 bed. If he was so smart, let him fix the whole garden. Dan replied that 1 bed was a start. That he wanted to show results, not promise a miracle. Bran snorted and said that outsiders always make promises, and then they leave. Dan didn't argue. He just asked where the river was. They showed him. A small stream half a kilometer to the west, murky and cold. Dan scooped some sand into a sack that Garrick had reluctantly given him. Then he went to see the widow Greta, who had goats. Greta looked at him suspiciously, but gave him the manure. She had plenty of it. She didn't know what to do with it and had piled it up behind the barn. The pile was old, at least 2 years old. Dan dug into it with a shovel and almost laughed. Perfectly rotted manure, dark and crumbly, with the scent of the forest after rain. Just what he needed. He hauled 4 baskets to the garden and got to work. The system offered prompts, but Dan knew the routine even without it. First, he removed the top layer of the bed to the depth of a shovel blade. He set it aside. Then he mixed the sand with the manure right on the ground. He added the ash he'd collected from the communal fire pit. He stirred it. He laid it back down. He tamped it down. He watered it with water from the well. The system flashed. 3 energy units spent. Process initiated. Hydrogen level restoration. Estimated time, 6 days. Dan straightened up and looked at the garden bed. Nothing special, just dug up soil. But he knew that the process had already begun beneath the surface. The bacteria in the manure had awakened. The ash had begun to neutralize the acid. The sand had loosened the structure. In a week, this soil would be different. He worked all day. He hauled water, leveled the edges, gathered stones. By evening, his hands were buzzing. His back ached. The system showed that his energy had recovered by 4 units. He'd earned them with sweat and calluses. Literally. Evelyn watched him all day. She didn't approach him. She didn't ask. She just watched from behind the fence of her front garden while sorting through dry roots. In the evening, when Dan returned to the hayloft, she set a bowl of something. Not porridge, a thin soup with roots and some bitter-tasting meat. Dan ate it all. Evelyn sat down across from him and asked why a garden for Martha specifically. Why not for the village head or the blacksmith?
For those who make the decisions.
Dan thought for a moment and said that the village head and the blacksmith needed proof. And proof grows best, grow where they're needed most. Martha needs cabbage more than anyone else, so the results will be clearer. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that her husband always started with the hardest part too. That he believed that if you fix what's most broken, the rest will fix itself. She stood up and went into the house without saying goodbye. Dan could say her clattering with dishes behind the wall. Then it went quiet. The next morning, the work continued. Dan transplanted the cabbage seedlings to a new bed. Tiny, pitiful sprouts. But the soil around them had already begun to change. The system showed progress. The hydrogen index had risen to 4.8. Not perfect yet, but already better. On the 3rd day, Martha herself came to the garden bed. She stood silently. She watched. Dan worked and paid no attention to her. On the 4th day, the seedlings straightened up. The leaves became slightly darker, slightly thicker. On the 5th day, everyone noticed it. The cabbage was growing. Not like before, faster, more evenly. The leaves were green, not yellow-gray. On the 6th day, the heads were the size of 2 fists. In the community garden next door, the cabbage remained the same, pitiful and bitter. The contrast was striking. On the 7th day, Dan cut the first head, large, dense, bright green. He took it to Martha. The old woman took the cabbage in both hands and stared at it for a long time. Then she bit off a leaf right there, raw, and froze. No bitterness, slightly sweet, crunchy. Martha ate and said nothing. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. By evening, she had cooked cabbage soup from that head. She ate 2 bowls. In the morning, she got up from the bench and walked to the well on her own, without a cane, for the first time in 5 years. By lunchtime, the whole village knew about it. By evening, there was a line at Dan's garden bed. A line stood by the garden every morning. People came and just looked. They touched the leaves. They sniffed the soil. Some tried to steal a head of cabbage, and Dan didn't stop them. Let them take it. The more people who try it, the faster they'll believe. The problem was something else. One garden plot is just one garden plot. Dan couldn't feed 100 people with cabbage. He needed more. More land, more manure, more ash, more hands, and more energy. The system showed 18 units. He had earned them through 6 days of non-stop labor. Martha's garden bed had cost 3 units. That meant he'd need about 30 for the entire community garden, and he didn't even want to look at Scar behind the stockade. The cost there ran into the hundreds. Dan decided to proceed in stages. First, the garden, then the Scar. He went to Garrick and said he was ready to take on the whole plot, but he needed help. People, at least 5, to carry sand and manure, to clear away rocks, to water. Garrick listened with a stony face. Then he asked what Dan wanted in return. Dan replied that he wanted to eat 3 times a wear and not to be kicked out. Garrick snorted. He'd apparently expected something more. He assigned 3 people, 2 guys and a girl. Young, around 17 or 18. The guys were brothers, Tim and Randy, freckled and as tall as poles. The girl's name was Nora, quiet, with dark circles under her eyes and hands accustomed to hard work. All 3 looked at Dan with curiosity, but without respect. To them, he was just a stranger who knew how to dig in the dirt. Dan didn't bother with speeches. He handed each of them a shovel and told them to dig. The work was hard. The community garden was so neglected that the topsoil had turned into a compacted crust. Beneath it lay clay mixed with stones. Not a single earthworm. Not one. Dan explained as they worked. He didn't lecture, he just spoke. This reddish stuff is iron. There's too much of it. This crust means water doesn't penetrate deep. It sits on top and rots. This whitish coating here is salt. It burns the plants. Tim asked how he knew that. Dan said he'd studied it. Randy asked where. Dan said, far away. Nora didn't ask anything. She just dug and listened. By the end of the first day, Dan noticed that she was memorizing everything. Every word, every gesture. She repeated after him exactly and without mistakes. When he showed her how to mix sand with manure properly, she did it right the first time. Dan made a mental note of that. The work took 10 days. Every morning they arrived at the garden at dawn. They dug, they hauled, they mixed, they watered. The system expended energy in bursts, 2 or 3 units a day. Dan replenished it by digging at night on his small plot that Garrick had set aside for him behind the hayloft. The trick was that energy returned only through physical labor in the soil. No lying down, no thinking. Only with your hands. Only in the soil. On the 5th day, a confrontation occurred. Bran the blacksmith came to the garden and stood by the fence. He watched Dan work. Then he said loudly that the newcomer was wasting the village's time on nonsense, that this land had always been this way and no dirt under his fingernails would change it, that he needed Tim and Randy in the smithy, not in the garden beds. Dan straightened up. He looked at Bran. He said nothing. He went back to work. Bran stood there for another minute and left. But from that day on, the atmosphere changed. The village was divided. The elders, led by Bran and a few older men, considered Dan a charlatan. The young people, including Tim, Randy, and Nora, took his side. Garrick remained neutral. He waited for the results. On the 10th day, the results came in. The entire garden had turned green. It hadn't just sprouted, it had actually turned green. Thick, even, and vibrant. The cabbage was filling out. The carrots had straightened up, and the tops had turned dark and healthy. The onions had swelled to normal size. The turnips that Dan had planted as an extra had already shown their first leaves. The system generated a report. Hydrogen index 5.8. Organic matter 3.2%. Microbiome restored by 40%. Soil mana activity detected minimal. The last line made Dan freeze. Mana activity. In ordinary village soil. He reread it 3 times, and he crouched down and placed his palms on the ground. He closed his eyes and felt it. Something warm, barely perceptible, like a faint pulse beneath the skin. The earth was responding. It was alive. Not like on the scar, where everything was poisoned and dead, and not like ordinary dirt. This earth had begun to produce something. Something hadn't been here for 200 years. Mana. A small garden in a backwater village on the edge of the cursed wasteland had begun to generate mana. Dan crouched there and smiled. Then he stood up, dusted himself off, and walked toward the palisade. It was time to take a closer look at Scar. He stepped outside the gate. A guard shouted at him that he was crazy. Dan waved his hand and stepped onto the black earth. The system activated instantly. Mana toxin, 84%. Hydrogen index, 3.2. Organic matter, 0.3%. Soil temperature, 4 degrees below ambient. No microbiome. Recommendation: complete decontamination is impossible at current energy levels. Suggested to start with a 5 by 5 meter section directly against the wall. Dan looked at the black grass around him, at the spikes, at the murky air above the wasteland. Then he looked at the palisade behind him. Between the wall and the start of the thorns was about 20 meters of relatively clear space. The black grass grew less densely here. There were almost no thorns. The air smelled, but not as strongly. He dropped to his knees. He took off his gloves. He placed his palms on the black earth. The system flashed. Diagnostics running. Deep analysis. And Dan saw something he hadn't expected. Beneath the layer of mana toxin, beneath the crust of dead earth, half a meter deep, the soil was different. Not healthy, but not dead either. It was like a patient in a coma. All structures were intact. Minerals were present. Traces of ancient humus were present. Even spores of some fungi in a dormant state. This soil hadn't died 200 years ago. It had fallen asleep and waited. Dan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. It left a black streak on his skin. He looked at the horizon of the scar. Miles of black wasteland. Thousands of hectares of seemingly dead earth. And beneath it, life had been sleeping all this time. He stood up. He returned to the village. He asked Nora for 2 shovels. He asked Greta for more manure. He asked Evelyn for mustard seeds if she had any. Evelyn raised her eyebrows and asked why he needed mustard. Dan said that mustard cleans the soil. It draws out heavy metals. It loosens the soil with its roots. And it kills pests. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she silently went into the house and returned with a small bag of seeds. Just enough for a couple of garden beds. Dan said that would be enough. Work on the scar began the next morning. Dan marked out a 5 by 5 meter plot right next to the palisade wall, close to the village, in plain sight of everyone. He did it on purpose. Let them watch. Let them see every step. On the first day, he just removed the top layer. The black crust was as hard as asphalt. The shovel rang out. His hands went numb from the blows. The system was expending energy to neutralize toxins with every clod he lifted. 1 unit per square meter. After 2 hours, he had 4 units left out of 22. Dan stopped. He sat right down on the black soil. He thought. At this rate, he wouldn't have enough energy to cover even half the marked-off area. He needed to change his approach. He remembered how they cleaned up the site in Oregon after the oil spill. They didn't clean it all up at once. They planted phytoremediators, sunflowers, mustard, rapeseed. The plants drew the toxins out of the soil with their roots. Slower, but 1,000 times cheaper. Dan looked at the little bag of mustard seeds, then at the system. He asked mentally if it was possible to sow mustard directly into the toxic soil and direct the cleanup process through the plants instead of direct neutralization. The system flashed. Calculation: yes, possible. Energy consumption: 0.3 units per square meter, provided that sanitation plants are sown. Purification time increases from 1 day to 14 days. Dan smirked. 14 days instead of 1. But at least he'd be able to treat the entire plot, not just a quarter of it. He took out the seeds. Mustard looked a little different in this world. The seeds were larger and had a reddish tint, but the principle was the same: a cruciferous plant, a powerful root, rapid growth. Dan sowed by hand, each seed in a separate hole. He watered each hole. The system directed its energy not toward cleansing the soil, but toward sustaining the seed's life in a toxic environment, like an incubator. It gave them a chance to sprout before the poison killed them. By evening, the entire plot was sown, 25 square meters. It took 8 units. Dan had 14 left. He felt tired, not only in his muscles, but somewhere deeper. The system was taking from him. Not health, not years of life. More like concentration, focus. After a major drain of energy, the world became slightly hazier. Sounds came through as if muffled by cotton wool. It went away after he slept, but Dan remembered the sensation. You can't drain yourself completely. He waited 3 days, watered the plot, monitored the system, helped out in the community garden. He taught Nora to distinguish between acidic and alkaline soil by touch. The girl picked it up instantly. On the 4th day, the first mustard sprout poked through the black earth. Green, bright. Against the black earth, it looked like a lantern in the dark. Nora was the first to see it. She was standing by the stockade when she suddenly froze. Then she ran to Dan. Her face looked as if she'd seen a dead man rise from the grave. In a way, that's exactly what had happened. By the end of the first week, there were already dozens of sprouts, green dots in a black field, small and fragile, but alive. The village came to watch, even Bran. He stood by the palisade and said nothing. His face showed no emotion, but he came every day. The system showed progress. The mana-toxin level in the planting zone had dropped to 71%. The mustard was working. Its roots drew the poison from the depths and stored it in the leaves. In 2 weeks, when the plants grow and need to be cut down and removed, some of the poison will go with them. Then the second planting, then the third. Each cycle would reduce the toxicity. On the 8th day, Evelyn came. Not to the garden, to the plot at Scar. She stood and looked at the green sprouts in the middle of the black earth. Then she crouched down and touched one of them, gently, with her fingertips. Dan noticed her hands were shaking. She said her husband Alan had tried to do the same thing 5 years ago. Not at Shram, in their own front yard, which had been poisoned after the epidemic. He believed he could bring the garden back to life. He worked every day. He talked to the plants. He mixed his concoctions with the soil. Nothing helped. 6 months later, he fell ill himself. 2 months after him, their daughter passed away. Little Lottie, 3 years old. Evelyn fell silent. Dan was silent too. There are no words for something like that, in any language, in any world. Then he did the only thing he could. He took the second little bag of seeds. Not mustard, lavender. He had found it among Evelyn's dry supplies 2 days ago and asked for permission. He said he wanted to plant lavender in her front garden. Not for the village, not for healing. For her. Because he'd noticed a dried lavender bouquet on a shelf in her house, next to a little wooden horse. A child's toy. Evelyn looked at the little bag of seeds, then at Dan. Then she lowered her gaze and said that Lottie loved lavender, that she'd only fall asleep when Evelyn put a sprig under her pillow. Dan nodded. He knew. Not because someone had told him, but because he'd seen that bouquet, and the horse, and the empty little bed in the corner of the house behind the curtain. That evening, he dug up Evelyn's front garden. The system spent 2 units on soil restoration. He planted the lavender, not in straight rows like in a vegetable garden, but in a semicircle, the way they plant in small gardens in Provence, so that when the flowers grow, they'll form a little shelter, a place where you can sit in the center, close your eyes, and just breathe. Evelyn stood by the door and watched. She didn't come out. She didn't get in the way. When Dan finished, he washed his hands and went up to the hayloft without saying a word. At night, he heard Evelyn go out into the front garden. He heard her sit down on the ground next to the seedlings. He heard the silence. Long, deep. The silence of a man who, for the first time in 5 years, allowed himself to remember. By morning, 20 more sprouts had emerged in Scar's garden beds. The green patch was visible from the village square. People stopped and watched. Children ran up to the fence and pointed. Martha came with 2 bowls of borscht. She set one down for Dan, the second for Evelyn, and she left without saying a word. Bran came the next day, not with reproaches, with a question. He asked if Dan could do something about the charcoal he was burning for the forge. The charcoal was turning out poorly. It was crumbling. It gave off little heat. Dan looked at the coal and said that the wood Bran used to make the coal grew in acidic soil. The wood was loose and watery. If the trees grew in normal soil, the coal would be twice as dense and burn 3 times longer. Bran said nothing. Then he turned and left. But that evening he brought Dan a horseshoe. He simply placed it by the entrance to the hayloft. He said nothing. Dan hung the horseshoe above the door. Dan began clearing the black scar by planting medicinal mustard and managed to get the first green shoots to sprout on the cursed land. Evelyn told him about the death of her husband and daughter, and Dan planted lavender in her front garden. Blacksmith Bran began to change his attitude toward the stranger after Dan explained the problem with his coal. A month had passed since Dan's arrival in Iron Hill. The mustard patch on the scar had gone through 2 full cycles. The first crop had grown and been harvested. The leaves, full of toxins, were burned in a separate pit far from the village. The second crop was already sprouting. The system showed a mana-toxin level of 52%, a halving in a month. The hydrogen level had risen to 4.1. It was still bad, but no longer fatal. Dan expanded the plot. Now it covered 20 by 20 meters, 400 square meters. By Schramm's standards, it was nothing, a grain of sand on a black beach. But by Iron Hill's standards, it was a miracle. On the cleared plot, Dan planted his first vegetables: carrots, onions, turnips, 3 rows of a new variety of cabbage that he had bred by crossing Evelyn's seeds with wild grass found by the stream. The system helped. It showed which genes were compatible, which ones would provide resistance to residual toxins. The energy cost was high, 15 units per selection. Dan worked them off over 4 nights of non-stop digging in the backyard. His hands were worn down to the flesh. Evelyn silently rubbed them with her ointment every morning. The result was worth every callus. The new cabbage grew twice as fast as usual. The heads were large and dense. But the main thing was something else. When Dan cut open the first head and placed half of it on the ground, the system revealed something unexpected. Monosaturation of the product, 3 units. Property: relieves fatigue when consumed. Duration of effect: 4 hours. Dan sat in front of the cut cabbage and stared at those numbers. Cabbage. Ordinary village cabbage. It produced a magical effect. Not because he had cast a spell, not because he had used an artifact, but because he had grown it in healthy soil. Soil that had accumulated mana from the restored microbiome, from the worms he had bred, from the mycelium that had begun to grow in the compost. Mana flowed from the bottom up, from the soil to the roots, from the roots to the stem, from the stem to the head. A natural cycle. No magic, just agronomy. He laughed. He sat alone on the edge of the scar and laughed until his stomach ached. 3 days later, he planted the first apple trees. 6 saplings, small and fragile. He had grown them from seeds found in the village's stores. Wild apple trees grew in the thicket west of Ironhall, small and sour. But the system saw their potential. With the right soil and targeted breeding, in a few months they could bear fruit with enough mana to have a real effect. Endurance apples. Dan planted them right in the center of the cleared area. He made a ring of compost and ash around each sapling. He watered them. The system spent 2 units on each. Total cost, 12 units. He had 6 left. He was exhausted, but satisfied. In the evening, he sat on the hayloft threshold and looked at Evelyn's front garden. The lavender had sprouted. Small gray-green bushes stood in a semicircle. In a couple of weeks, they would bloom. Every evening, Evelyn sat among them, silently, sometimes with a cup of tea, sometimes just like that. Dan didn't ask. He didn't pry. There are wounds that heal only with silence and time. And lavender. The following week, everything changed. Dan was at Scar, checking on the 3rd cycle of mustard. Nora was helping him mark off plots for expansion. Tim and Randy were hauling manure. A typical workday. Then Randy froze. He stared off toward the south. Dan looked up. Figures were moving on the horizon, 5 or 6. They were coming from the direction of the Scar, not on the road, across the wasteland. It was impossible. No one walks across the Scar. Dan himself had barely made it on the first day, and he was alone. And these people were walking in a group, slowly, with difficulty, but they were walking. The guard in the watchtower rang the bell. The village stirred. Men with weapons gathered at the gate. Garrick came with a sword at his belt, Bran with a hammer. 20 minutes later, the figures were close enough to make out the details. They were people, not beasts. People. 5 of them, in armor, with weapons. But the armor was hacked to pieces and covered in black slime. The weapons were jagged. One of them was leaning on another. 2 were limping. One was carrying someone on his back. The wounded. Dan stepped toward them first. Herrick shouted for him to stop. Dan didn't stop. He reached the first one, a young guy, 20 years old, maybe younger. His face was ashen with pain and exhaustion. The armor on his left side had been pierced. Blood mixed with black slime oozed from beneath the metal. The guy looked at Dan with cloudy eyes and said they needed help. That they were from the Silver Blade Guild. Sword Mistress Sayan Park's squad. They had been chasing the Whirlings and got lost in the fog on the Scar. Their commander was dead. They'd been walking for 2 days now. Dan turned toward the village and shouted for water. Evelyn was already running with a bag of herbs and bandages. Nora was dragging a bucket. Tim and Randy carried a stretcher made of poles and burlap. The 5 of them were led into the village. They were laid down in the community hall. Evelyn began treating the wounds. The black slime on the armor turned out to be Vorling blood. Poisonous. It was eating away at the skin slowly but surely. Evelyn washed the wounds with her decoctions, but it was clear that wasn't enough. Dan looked at the wounded. Then he turned and walked briskly toward the garden. 10 minutes later, he returned with 3 heads of the new cabbage, the very same kind. The one with mana-infused properties. Evelyn looked at him doubtfully. Dan told her to give the wounded cabbage broth, not raw, broth. Hot. Evelyn didn't argue. She trusted him. Not his words, his hands. She had seen what those hands did with the earth, and if they said cabbage healed, then cabbage healed. An hour later, each of the 5 had drunk a bowl of hot cabbage broth. 3 hours later, the fever had subsided in 3 of them. 6 hours later, the wounded man with the punctured side had stopped coughing up blood. By morning, all 5 were asleep, peacefully, without moans, without fever. Evelyn sat among them and looked at her hands, then at Dan standing in the doorway. She said it was impossible, that the Vorling poison kills within 3 days, and she had never had a cure for it. Dan replied that the cure wasn't in the cabbage. The cure was in the soil where the cabbage grew. Evelyn was silent. Then she nodded, slowly, like a person accepting something very. In the morning, Dan went out to the community house. The wounded were sitting on the porch, pale, weak, but alive. Among them, he noticed a figure he hadn't made out yesterday in the commotion. A short girl with a short braid slung over her shoulder. A scar cut diagonally across her left eyebrow. Her hands were bandaged. A sword lay on her lap. A long, heavy, 2-handed sword that she held as if it were part of her body. Seon Park, a rank B swordswoman. She looked straight at Dan without taking her eyes off him. Then she asked who he was. Dan said he was a farmer. Seon didn't smile. She said that farmers don't save people from whirling poison with cabbage soup. Dan shrugged and replied that good farmers do a lot of unexpected things. Seon was silent for about 5 seconds. Then something flashed across her face. Not a smile, a shadow of something. Curiosity, perhaps? She said her squad would leave as soon as they were back on their feet, that they had to return to the guild, that the commander was dead and they needed to report it. Dan nodded and said that while they were here, they could eat as much as they wanted. He went to the shed and came back with an apple, small and plain, a wild apple from the woods, not a mana apple, just a regular one. But he'd baked it that morning over coals with honey that Nora had traded for from a beekeeper halfway along the road. He held out the apple to Seon. She looked at him, at the apple, at him. Then she took it, took a bite, chewed slowly, and something happened to her face. The muscles around her mouth twitched. Her eyes flashed. She turned away quickly, but Dan had noticed. A B-rank swordswoman was crying over a baked apple. Without turning around, she said that no one had ever cooked for her just like that. That at the orphanage, they gave her food because they had to. At the guild, because she paid. But no one had ever baked an apple for her, just because she was standing on the porch and it was a cold morning. Dan didn't answer. He sat down next to her on the step and remained silent. 2 days later, the party was ready to leave, the 4 of them. Seon stopped Dan at the gate. She said she would return. She didn't ask if she could. She didn't ask for permission. She just stated it as a fact. She said that this garden had no protection, that sooner or later someone would come and take what Dan had built, or burn it down. She said she would protect this garden. Dan asked why. Seon didn't answer right away. Then she said it was because the apple was warm. She turned and walked down the road toward the north. Her back was straight, a sword slung over her shoulder. Her braid swayed. Dan watched her until she disappeared around the bend. Then he turned to Scar. The green patch in the middle of the black wasteland was now visible even from the gate. 400 square meters of living earth. 6 apple saplings, 3 rows of cabbage, carrots, onions, turnips, and a small flickering mana spring the size of a coin. The first in 200 years on this land. It glowed with a soft greenish light right in the center of the plot. The system had detected it yesterday. Mana source, minimum class, power 0.02 units per day. Origin, natural regeneration through a restored biome, 0.02 units. Nothing. Less than nothing. But 200 years ago, there wasn't even that here. Dan crouched down next to the source. He placed his palm on the ground. The earth was warm, for the first time since he'd arrived here. Warm not from the sun, from somewhere deep inside. The system flashed. Response detected. Deep layer. Distance unmeasurable. Signal type unknown. Dan withdrew his hand. Something was down there. Far away, very far away. But it responded to every green sprout that rose from the black earth above. He didn't know what it was, not yet, but he could feel it. Every seed he planted in this soil didn't just grow upward. It reached downward, toward something that was waiting. Dan grew the first mana-infused vegetables and saved a wounded squad of heroes from the Vorling poison with cabbage broth. The swordswoman Seon Park promised to return and defend the garden. On the cleared section of the scar, the first mana source appeared, and the system detected an unknown response from deep within the earth. Seon returned 3 weeks later. Dan hadn't been counting the days, but Nora had. 19 days. The swordswoman didn't come alone. Following her was a burly guy with an eye patch and an axe on his back. A fighter from her guild named Cullen. Seon dropped a bag by the gate and said that Cullen would help with security, that the guild had written him off after his eye injury and he had nowhere else to go anyway. Cullen shook Dan's hand without saying a word. His palm was like a shovel. Dan showed them the plot on the scar. Seon stood there and looked at it for a long time. The green patch had grown. Now it covered nearly 30 by 30 meters. The third cycle mustard had run its course, and Dan had started the fourth planting, no longer with mustard, but with a mixture. Mustard to clean the topsoil, lupin for nitrogen, sunflower-like plants to extract heavy metals from the depths. The 3 plants worked as a team. Each did its part. The system showed a mana toxin level of 38% in the center of the plot. At the edges, it was still 60, but the center was already almost suitable for normal crops. The apple trees had grown 1/2 meter, small but sturdy. The leaves were dark green, not a single yellow spot. Healthy trees on land where nothing but thorns had grown for 200 years. Seon touched the trunk of the nearest apple tree. She ran her fingers over the bark. Then she looked at Dan and said it was the strangest thing she'd ever seen in her life. And she'd seen a dragon the size of a tower. Dan replied that a dragon was just a big lizard. But an apple tree on dead ground was a real miracle. Seon snorted, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Cullen walked around the perimeter and said the position was terrible. Open field on all sides. The only cover was the village stockade. If serious people came, there was nothing to hold them back. Dan said there weren't any serious people yet. Cullen replied that he didn't like the word yet. He was right. Rumors were already spreading. Dan knew this because people were heading toward Iron Hill. Not in crowds, one by one, 2 at a time. A wandering merchant who'd stumbled in by chance and spotted the green patch on the scar. An old pilgrim making his way to some temple up north. 2 refugees from a village ravaged by the Vorlings. Each of them left, carrying a story with them. About a farmer who heals cursed land. About the cabbage that made an old woman walk again. About the green sprouts on the black scar. The stories multiplied. They grew richer with details. Dan understood that soon it wouldn't be merchants or pilgrims who would come. Those who wouldn't like these stories would come. For now, he worked. Every day from dawn until dark. He expanded the plot, deepened the clearing, planted new crops. Nora became his right-hand woman. She learned everything he showed her and began doing things that surprised even him. One morning she came and said she had transplanted 3 mustard bushes to the western edge of the plot because she'd noticed the toxin levels were higher there than in the east. Dan checked. She was right. He hadn't taught her to use the system. She didn't have the system. She simply saw. By the color of the leaves, by the way the soil dried, by the smell. A farmer's eye. Dan recognized that instinct. His grandfather had the same one. A month after Seon's return, another guest arrived in the village. A young girl, about 19. Small and thin, with big, frightened eyes, and a dress that was too nice for the road. The fabric was expensive, but dirty and torn in 3 places. Her shoes were falling apart. Her hands were white, without a single callus. She said her name was Yuna, and that she was looking for work. Any kind. She could wash dishes, she could do laundry, maybe carry water. Garrick looked at her hands and snorted. He said hands like that weren't worth a penny in the village. The girl flinched. Her face turned pale. She said she would try her best, that she had nowhere else to go. Evelyn intervened. She said she would take her in, as a housekeeper and herb gatherer. Dan looked at the girl and noticed the details. Her posture was straight despite her fatigue. Her speech was proper. Too proper for a commoner. She was lying. Her name wasn't Yuna. Her dress wasn't just nice, it was aristocratic. And she was running from something, or from someone. Dan said nothing. It wasn't his business. If the girl wanted to be Yuna, let her be Yuna. 2 days later, he gave her a task: to plant a row of strawberries in the community garden. He had cultivated the strawberries from wild berries growing along the stream. The system helped select the best specimens, large, sweet, and cold-resistant. Yuna stood before the garden bed as if facing an abyss. She didn't know how to hold the trowel, didn't know which way to plant the sprout. She didn't know how much to water them. Dan didn't laugh. He didn't tease her. He didn't sigh. He knelt down beside her and showed her, slowly, step by step. This is how you hold the seedling. This is how you make a hole. This is how you lower the roots. This is how you cover it with soil. This is how you water it. Not much, a glass of water, so the soil embraces the roots. Yuna repeated the steps. Her hands were shaking. She planted the first seedling crookedly. The second one went in deeper than it should have. The third one fell out of the hole. The fourth one turned out right. Straight, neat, roots down, leaves up. The soil around it was packed down. Yuna looked at her sprout, and her face bore the expression Dan had seen on the faces of people who had harvested their first crop. Amazement. That it was possible. That she had managed it. That something had grown from her hands. By evening, she had planted the entire row. 18 plants, half of them crooked, a third too deep, but all alive. Yuna stood in front of the garden bed with dirty hands and dirty knees, smiling so broadly that Nora turned away to hide her own smile. Dan said she would water them tomorrow. Yuna nodded, hastily, joyfully. Then she caught herself and tried to look calm. It didn't work. At night, Dan sat on the hayloft threshold and thought. The plot on Scar was expanding. The garden was yielding a harvest. People were coming. But there wasn't enough energy. 30 units in reserve. Expansion costs 5 to 7 units a day. Recovery through work, 4 to 5 units. A deficit. Small, but constant. He was spending more than he was earning. He worked himself to exhaustion every night and still ended up in the red. The system flashed. A suggestion. A method to increase energy regeneration has been discovered. Working together with other people in the terraforming zone boosts regeneration by 15% for each participant. Dan reread it. Working together. Not just his hands in the soil, but other people's hands, right next to his. In the soil he had already analyzed.
someone else's sweat on his plot increased his energy.
He laughed quietly so as not to wake Evelyn. Of course it was. The Earth doesn't like loners. The Earth loves communities. In the morning, he gathered Nora, Tim, Randy, and Una. He led them to the scar. He gave each of them a plot. He explained what to do. Dig, loosen the soil, sow mustard, water. The four of them got to work. The system flashed. Energy regeneration increased by 60%. Dan felt the difference instantly. It was as if someone had turned on a second generator. Energy was flowing back faster than he was using it. For the first time in a month, he was in the black. He stood at the edge of the plot and watched as four young people dug in the black soil. Nora, focused and precise. Tim and Randy trading jokes. Una, diligent and slow, covered in mud up to her elbows and with a happy face. They didn't know they were helping him. They thought they were helping the garden. There was no contradiction in that. 6 months since Dan's arrival in Illyria. The garden by the stockade now covered nearly a hectare. The green patch was visible from a kilometer away. Against the backdrop of the endless black wasteland, it looked like an oasis in the desert, which, in fact, was true. 10 hectares of the scar had undergone the first cycle of mustard purification. Mana-toxin levels in the central zone had dropped to 20%. The apple trees had grown to 2 meters tall, strong trunks, broad crowns, and the first flowers had appeared on 3 of the 6 trees, white with a pinkish tint. Their scent was so strong that bees flew in from a grove 2 kilometers away. Dan had specifically lured the wild bees. He planted honey-bearing flowers along the edges of the plot. The system suggested which species were compatible with the local fauna. The bees came for the nectar. They stayed for the pollen. They began pollinating the apple trees. The circle was complete. The ecosystem was working. Not perfectly, not entirely, but it was working. Each link supported the other. The worms loosened the soil. The mycelium distributed nutrients among the roots. The bees pollinated the flowers. The flowers produced seeds. The seeds fell into healthy soil and sprouted on their own. Without the system, without energy, simply because the earth was alive. There were now 3 mana sources. Small, weak, but they pulsed in the earth like little hearts. The system showed a total output of 0.12 units per day. Ridiculous by the standards of the aristocrats' starfields, but here on the Black Scar, it was tantamount to a miracle. Iron Hill had changed too. Not on the outside. The houses were the same, the street was the same, the well was the same. But people walked differently. Their backs were straighter, their voices louder. Children played in the square instead of hiding behind fences. The community garden yielded so much that they began salting and drying the surplus for the winter. For the first time in many years, the village had reserves. Bran foraged not only for his own people. He made tools for the garden, shovels, hoes, rakes, special trowels for transplanting seedlings that Dan had sketched for him with a stick in the dirt. The blacksmith still hadn't thanked Dan, but there were already 3 horseshoes above the hayloft door. Garrick had thawed. Not completely. The village elder was, by nature, a cautious man, and change frightened him. But he saw the results. He saw that people had stopped leaving, that the young people were staying, that newcomers were arriving in the village. A family from a neighboring estate, an elderly couple from the south, a wandering carpenter who was looking for work and found it. Iron Hill was growing. Slowly, but growing. The first merchant arrived at the beginning of the 6th month, a fat, cheerful man named Dorman. He traded between towns. He'd heard the story about the green scar and came to check it out. Dan showed him the garden. Dorman walked between the rows and shook his head.
Then he tasted the cabbage. He chewed for a long time. His expression shifted from skeptical to surprised, and from surprised to eager. He asked how much Dan wanted for a batch of such cabbage. Dan said the cabbage wasn't for sale. Dorman raised his eyebrows. Dan said he had something better. He led the merchant to the apple trees. The first fruits hung from 3 trees, small, green with a red blush. Not yet ripe, but the system showed that the mana saturation had already reached 8 units. In a month, when they ripen, it will be 15. Property: restores stamina upon consumption. Effect lasts 8 hours. Dan picked an apple. He handed it to Dorman. The merchant took a bite, chewed, swallowed. A minute later, his eyes widened. He said the fatigue from 2 days of riding had just vanished, that his legs had stopped aching, that he felt as if he'd slept for 3 days straight. Dan said it was an endurance apple, that in a month there would be 3 ripe ones, that the price of 1 apple was equal to the price of a good cow. Dorman was silent. Then he laughed and said Dan was crazy, that for such an apple, the Heroes Guild would pay not a cow, but a horse, a thoroughbred war horse. Because for a hero marching against the horde of rot, 8 hours without fatigue is the difference between life and death. They shook hands. 3 apples in a month, each worth a war horse. Dorman rode off, and Dan sat on a stump and did the math in his head.
3 horses. That's more than Iron Hill's entire annual income. For 3 apples. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that now every merchant within a 100-kilometer radius would hear about the garden. And through them, every aristocrat, every guild, every mage. Time was running out. He had to grow the garden before those who wanted to take it away arrived. The following week, Dan began the project he'd feared from the very start. A forest belt. Not just a row of trees, a living barrier around the entire cleared plot. He planted fast-growing willows along the western edge, oak-like trees along the eastern edge. Between them, shrubs with a dense root system that intertwined underground and created an impenetrable network. The system spent 40 units on this, more than on everything else combined. Dan worked for 3 days straight, with almost no sleep. Nora, Tim, and Randy worked alongside him. Una carried water and food. Seon stood guard. Cullen chopped away the thorns, clearing the approaches. By the end of the 3rd day, a thin strip of saplings stood along the garden. Fragile and small, but alive. In 6 months, they would become a wall. In a year, they would alter the microclimate. The wind from the scar, carrying toxic spores, would break against the crowns. Moisture would be. The temperature inside the garden would rise by 2 degrees. That was enough to grow crops that would freeze out in the open scar. Dan stood at the edge of the tree line, filthy beyond recognition. His hands wouldn't obey him. His knees buckled. The system showed 2 units of energy, almost 0. Evelyn approached from behind and silently placed a hand on his shoulder. He turned. She held out a mug of tea, the same kind, bitter and warming. Dan took the mug with both hands because he couldn't hold it with just one. He drank. Evelyn said he'd kill himself if he kept working like that. Dan replied that he wouldn't. He'd just get tired. Evelyn said she knew people who'd said the same thing before they fell, and never got back up. Dan looked at her, at the wrinkle between her eyebrows, at her cracked hands, at the shadow behind her eyes that was always there. He said he'd be more careful. She said she didn't believe him. But there would be tea every evening. Dan smiled.
The lavender in her front yard had bloomed a week ago.
A purple semicircle around the little bench that Tim and Randy had cobbled together from old planks. Evelyn sat there every evening. And for the first time in 5 years, the light in her house stayed on late. Not because she was working. Because she didn't want to go to bed. Because finally, there was a reason to sit and look at the stars. They came at the end of the 7th month. Not the army yet. A delegation, 12 men on horseback. Fine horses, fine armor, cloaks bearing a coat of arms, a golden hawk on a black field. The coat of arms of Baron Corvas Drek. The guard in the tower rang the bell. The village fell silent. Seon was the first to step out to the gate, sword at her back. Her face was stony. Callan stood beside her, an axe in his hand. One eye, but he saw for two. Dan ordered Nora to take Una to Evelyn's house. Nora didn't ask why. She saw the coat of arms and turned pale. Una turned pale too, even more so. Her hands trembled, and she grabbed the door frame. Dan noticed. He remembered. Later. The delegation was not led by the Baron himself. A tall, thin man in a black doublet, a pale face, thin lips, eyes like 2 pebbles. He introduced himself. Verd Kaslik, steward of Baron Drek's lands. He had arrived on an inspection. There are reports of illegal land development on the territory of Black Scar. The Scar is Crown land. Any alteration of Crown land without the Crown's permission is a crime. He wants to inspect the site and compile a report. Garrick stepped forward. The village elder's voice was steady, but Dan saw his hands clench into fists behind his back. Garrick said that Ironhill held a royal charter granting the right to reside near the Scar. That the charter granted the right to use the adjacent lands for agricultural purposes. Kaslik smiled. It was an unpleasant place. He said that the charter granted the right to live near Shram, not the right to transform Shram. That these were different things. That Baron Drek, as the nearest lord, had jurisdiction over all undeveloped crown lands in the region, and that he strongly recommended allowing an inspection. Dan stepped out from behind Garrick. He said he would show them the garden. With pleasure. Let them look. Garrick shot him a quick glance. Dan nodded slightly. Trust me. He led Kaslik and his 4 men to Shram. The other 8 remained at the gate. Seon followed them like a shadow. Kaslik saw the garden and fell silent. For a long time. A green acre in the middle of a black wasteland. Neat rows of vegetables, apple trees bearing fruit, a strip of young trees along the edges, and the smell, the scent of living earth, fresh, warm, fertile, in the middle of a world that smelled of rusty iron and death. Kaslik slowly walked around the plot. He touched an apple tree. He picked up a clump of earth and examined it. The soil was dark and crumbly. Normal soil on the Black Scar. He turned to Dan and asked how. Dan said he'd worked with his hands. Kaslik asked for details. What magic? What artifact? What class? Dan said none. That he was a farmer. That he'd used compost, manure, ash, sand, and sanitation plants. Kaslik looked at him as if Dan were speaking a foreign language. Then he turned to one of his men. The man took out a notebook and began writing. Kaslik said that the Baron would be informed, that until royal permission was granted, all work on the Scar must be halted, that any expansion of the plot would be considered an illegal seizure of Crown land, that the punishment for this would be confiscation and imprisonment. Dan remained silent. Sion was silent. Cullen clenched his axe so tightly his knuckles turned white. Garrick stood behind them, his face as white as chalk. Kaslik mounted his horse. He looked down at the garden from above.
Then he said quietly, "The Baron proposes an alternative. The farmer may voluntarily transfer management of the garden to the Drek domain's balance sheet, in exchange for a position and a salary. A good salary." Dan replied with a single word: "No." Kaslik shrugged. He said it was to be expected, that the Baron was patient, but not infinitely so. He turned his horse around and rode off. The village exhaled, but it was a nervous sigh. Bran approached Dan and said quietly that Baron Drek was not one to back down, that he had 300 mercenaries, that he had burned the village of Crossstone 2 years ago for non-payment of tithes, that Iron Hill was to him a gnat he could swat without looking. Dan listened. Then he asked Bran if they could make traps, iron ones, with spikes, the kind they set for wolves. Bran raised his eyebrows. Then he smirked. The first real smirk Dan had seen on his face. The blacksmith said they could. Dan said, "Good," and turned to Sion. He said he needed to write a letter to that detachment. The 5 wounded men they'd come out with 4 months ago. Sion nodded. She knew where they were now. The Silver Blade Guild was based in the town of Rivenhall, 2 days' ride north. The letter left with Callan the next morning. Dan kept it brief. He didn't ask for help. He didn't complain. He simply described the situation. The Baron wants to take the garden. The garden feeds the village. The garden heals the wounded. If the Baron takes the garden, it will all be over. Dan didn't know if the letter would reach them. He didn't know if those 5 would respond. But he remembered the face of that boy who had cried over the cabbage soup, and he thought that people like that don't forget. A day after Kaslik's departure, another guest arrived at Iron Hill. A lone rider, a black horse, black clothing, black gloves even in the heat. A young man with a cold, handsome face and impeccable posture. He dismounted at the gate. He presented the guard with a document bearing the royal seal. He introduced himself. Liam Chue, Royal Land Inspector. He had arrived to verify information regarding the conversion of crown lands in the Black Shay. Garrick nearly collapsed to the ground. 2 inspectors in 3 days, one from the Baron, the other from the King. Dan looked at Liam. Liam looked at Dan. For a second, they studied each other in silence. Then Dan said dinner would be in an hour, and that there was a chair for Liam. Liam Cho ate in silence, neatly, his back straight. He took off his gloves only to pick up his spoon, and Dan noticed that his hands were well groomed but had thin white scars on his knuckles. Not from work, from sword training. The inspector was a fighter. Seated at the table were Dan, Evelyn Garrick, and Sion. Nora served the food. Yuna was hiding in Evelyn's house. Dan noticed that she had refused to come out when she found out that a man with the royal seal had arrived. Another detail to add to the collection. Liam tasted the soup. Vegetable soup, made from cabbage, carrots, and turnips from the garden's beds. Simple, but made with wholesome vegetables. Liam ate, and his expression didn't change. Only his eyes narrowed slightly after the 3rd spoonful. He sensed it. Mana in the food. Barely noticeable, but he sensed it. So not just an official. A mage, or something like that. After dinner, Liam asked to inspect the plot. Dan led him to the scar. It was already dark. But the garden glowed. Not brightly, barely noticeable. Mana sources in the soil gave off a faint, greenish glow, enough to see the outlines of the trees and the garden beds. Liam stopped at the border between the black earth and the green. He stood there for a long time. Then he crouched down. He took off his glove. He placed his palm on the soil. He closed his eyes. Dan watched. The system flashed. External mana detection detected. Source: human nearby. Ability class: undetermined. Liam was a mage, or something close to it. He was listening to the earth. A minute later, he opened his eyes. His face was still expressionless, but there was something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He said the earth was singing, softly, like a lullaby. Dan nodded. He knew. He heard it every time he placed his palms on the soil. Not in words, not in a melody, in a vibration, a sensation of warmth rising from below. Liam stood up. He brushed off his knee, put on a glove, said his report would be sent to the king's office in a week. That until then, he would remain in Iron Hill for a full assessment. Dan said, "Okay." For the next 5 days, Liam followed Dan like a shadow, watched him work. He jotted things down in a slim notebook. He inspected every plot. He measured things with his magic. Liam didn't speak unless necessary. He didn't joke. He didn't smile. He asked precise questions and waited for precise answers. What cleaning method was used? What plants were used? What was the resource consumption? What were the measurable results? Dan answered, directly, without embellishment. Compost, manure, ash, mustard, lupin, sunflowers, crop rotation, mycorrhiza. No magic except that which is in the earth itself. Liam took notes. On the 3rd day, he asked about the system. Not directly. He asked if Dan had a magic class or skill related to the earth. Dan paused. Then he said yes. That he had the ability to see the condition of the soil, to identify problems, to guide the restoration processes. Liam asked where it came from. Dan said he didn't know. That he woke up on the scar and the ability was with him. Liam looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded and wrote down that something. On the 4th day, Dan noticed that Liam hadn't eaten since morning. He asked why. Liam said he was used to getting by on very little. Dan didn't reply. On the morning of the 5th day, he placed a plate in front of the door to the room where Liam slept. Fresh bread made from flour from the communal garden. An apple. Not a mana apple, just a regular wild apple baked with honey. A mug of Evelyn's tea. Liam opened the door and saw the plate. He stood over it in silence. Then he sat down on the threshold and began to eat. Slowly. That's how people eat who aren't used to having meals prepared for them. That evening, he sat with Dan on the porch of the community house and spoke off-topic for the first time. He said he'd served the crown for 12 years, that he'd traveled through 300 villages, that he'd written 1,000 reports, and that not once in all those years had a plate been set out at his door just like that, without a request, without an expectation, without an attempt to bribe him. Dan replied that it wasn't a bribe, that a person should eat in the morning, that it wasn't up for debate. Liam was silent. Then he said quietly that his report would be honest, that he would write exactly what he saw. No more, no less. Dan said he hadn't expected anything else. On the 6th day, Liam asked to be shown the place where the system first detected the mana source. Dan led him to the center of the site. The source glowed with a faint green light. It was now the size of a palm. It had grown over the past month. Liam crouched down beside it. He took off both gloves. He placed both palms on the ground. He closed his eyes. Dan stood nearby and waited. A minute later, Liam opened his eyes. There was something new in them. Confusion. He said there was something beneath this spot, deep down, very deep down. Not a source, not a vein, something else. Something was alive. Dan nodded. He knew. The system was picking up a response from the depths, growing stronger every day. Liam said he had to report this to the capital. Dan said he understood. Liam paused. Then he said there were things best communicated to the right people in the right words. That the office was full of people who, upon hearing the words scar and awakening, would send an army here before they even figured it out. That he would write the report so that the right people would read what they needed to, and the wrong people wouldn't read anything they shouldn't. Dan looked at him. Liam looked at Dan. Something had formed between them. Not friendship. Not friendship. Understanding. Two people who had decided to trust each other because the choice was between trust and disaster. On the morning of the 7th day, Liam left. Before leaving, he walked over to Dan and held out his hand, without a glove. Dan shook it. Liam said he'd be back in a month, with a reply from the capital, and that until his return, Dan had better not expand the garden too conspicuously. Dan said he'd try. Liam allowed himself a hint of a smile, the first one in all that time. He said he didn't believe him. He mounted his horse and rode off. Seon stood nearby and watched him go. Then she said that this man was dangerous. Dan replied that dangerous people could be useful. Seon snorted and said that Dan trusted people too easily. Dan replied that a farmer who didn't trust the land wouldn't get a harvest. Seon said that the land didn't wear black gloves and didn't work for the king. Dan chuckled. Then he grew serious, because Seon was right. Liam Cho was the king's inspector, and whatever he might feel sitting by the mana spring, his first duty was to the crown. Dan hoped that honesty would outweigh duty. But hope is not a strategy. He turned to Seon and said they needed to prepare. Not for Liam, for the Baron. Kaslik had seen the garden. Kaslik had reported. The Baron knows what is here, and the Baron will not wait for the crown's permission. The Baron will come himself. Royal Inspector Liam Choi spent a week in Ironhill studying the garden and discovered something alive deep beneath the scar. A cautious trust had developed between Liam and Dan. Liam promised to write an honest but cautious report for the crown. Dan began preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Baron Drek. Cullen returned 10 days later. Not alone. 5 riders followed him, young men, in the armor of the Silver Blade Guild, the very same 5 whom Dan had fed cabbage soup. Their faces had changed since then. Not older, harsher. 4 months of fighting on the border of the horde of rot had left their mark, but their eyes were the same, young. And when they saw Dan at the gate, there was something in those eyes that Dan didn't know the name of. Later, he realized it was loyalty. Their leader now was a guy named Ivan, the very one with the pierced side. The wound had healed. A scar remained. Ivan dismounted and stood before Dan. He stood at attention. He placed his hand over his heart. He said that the Silver Blade's 6th Mobile Squad was now at the disposal of the Garden of Heroes. That they had been discharged from the guild of their own volition. That they had come not by order, but by choice. Dan looked at the 5 of them. Boys, 18 or 19 years old. Written off. Broken. Having survived the death of their commander and 4 months of hell on the border. And they had come here. To him. To a farmer on the edge of the wasteland. Because once, he'd poured them some soup. Dan told them to get off their horses and come eat. Ivan smiled. For the first time in 4 months, judging by how unfamiliar it looked on his face. The 5 became part of Ironhill instantly. Not because the village accepted them right away. Quite the opposite. Garrick grumbled about extra mouths to feed. Bran grumbled that warriors were just in the way. But the 5 didn't sit around idly. Ivan asked Dan to show them what needed to be done. Dan gave them shovels. The Knights of the Silver Blade dug the garden beds. The professional fighters hauled manure. The swordsmen watered the seedlings. It was funny. and beautiful at the same time. Tim and Randy showed them how to hold a shovel properly. Nora explained the difference between acidic and alkaline soil. Una carried water for them and blushed every time one of the five smiled at her. The system recorded an increase in energy regeneration. 9 people were working on the plot: Dan, Nora, Tim, Randy, Una, and the 5 knights. Regeneration had increased by 135%. For the first time in months, Dan felt he had enough energy, more than enough. He could expand, faster, further. In 2 weeks, the plot had doubled in size, 2 hectares. The system was reducing toxicity in a ring pattern. The center was already clean. Monotoxin below 10%, almost normal soil. The apple trees yielded their first real harvest. 12 apples. Small, but each one's monosaturation reached 15 units. Property, stamina restoration.
Duration, 8 hours. Dormant arrived as promised. He took 3 apples. He paid in gold. Iron Hill had never seen so much gold in its entire history. Garrick counted the coins 3 times, then a 4th. Then he sat down and was silent for a long time. Dan distributed the remaining 9 apples. He gave 3 to Ivan's 5-man squad for training. 8 hours without fatigue allowed them to train twice as intensely. He gave 2 to Seon. She accepted them silently. She bit into one and chewed with her eyes closed. He gave 1 to Evelyn for medicinal purposes. She sliced it into thin wedges and dried them. Each slice retained its properties. Weaker than a fresh apple, but it retained them. It was a breakthrough. Dried apple slices could be stored for months, transported, given to the wounded in the field. A single dried apple slice could give a warrior 4 hours without fatigue. Evelyn looked at the dried slices, and her hands didn't tremble. They were steady. The hands of a healer who, for the first time in 5 years, knew that his medicine worked. Dan planted 2 apples. He cut each one open. He took out the seeds. 24 seeds. He planted them in a specially prepared bed. Mana-saturated soil, compost from mushroom beds, ash from Bran's forge. The system spent 10 units to accelerate growth. In a month, a sapling would sprout from each seed. In 6 months, the saplings would bear fruit. In a year, he would have an apple orchard. Not 6 trees, 24. And each would yield 10 to 15 apples per season. 300 endurance apples a year. Dan did the math in his head, and his head was spinning. Not from fatigue, but from the scale of it all. 300 apples, each worth the price of a war horse. This isn't a village. This is an economy. But the apples were just the beginning. Dan began working on the wheat. Ordinary wheat from the communal garden. Pathetic ears of wheat, small grains. He selected the best ones, planted them in mana-saturated soil. The system helped guide their growth. 3 weeks later, the ears of wheat rose, tall, heavy. The grain in each was large and golden. The system showed a mana-saturation of 5 units, a property. Bread made from this grain provided a feeling of fullness for 12 hours instead of the usual 4. A soldier who ate a slice of such bread could march all day without stopping. Dan stood before a strip of wheat and thought about how up north the horde of rot was waiting. The armies of heroes were dying of exhaustion faster than they were dying at the hands of the enemy. Because they had nothing to eat. Because the supply trains couldn't keep up. Because the land around the horde was dead and nothing grew on it. And here he stood, a farmer, with wheat that provides sustenance for 12 hours, with apples that relieve fatigue, with cabbage that cures the Vorling poison. He can feed armies.
Not with a sword, with bread. In the middle of the 8th month, another guest arrived in Iron Hill. This time without a horse, on foot, with 4 notebooks, wearing glasses, with a tight braid, and an allergy to dust that made her sneeze every 3 minutes on the dusty village road. Chue Bomne, junior master of the Silver Tree Academy. She stopped at the gate, sneezed, adjusted her glasses, looked around, saw a green spot on the scar, opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she took out a notebook and began writing, never taking her eyes off the garden. She wrote and walked at the same time and crashed into the gatepost. Her glasses flew off. The notebook fell into the mud. Bom got down on all fours to look for her glasses and muttered something about thaumaturgical anomalies and a violation of the 3rd law of mana-substrate diffusion. Nora picked up the glasses and handed them to her. Bom put them on. She looked at Nora. She looked at the garden. She looked at Dan, standing by the garden bed with a shovel in his hand. And she said, her voice full of academic horror, that this was impossible. That the cleansing of the black scar contradicts all known theories of mana geology. That the Silver Tree Academy proved the impossibility of restoring the scar 300 years ago. That the dissertation of the greatest magister, Ollendorf, describes 13 reasons why mana toxin cannot be biologically neutralized. Dan listened. Then he said he hadn't read Ollendorf's dissertation, but that the Earth hadn't read it either. Bom blinked. Then again. Then she opened a new notebook. The 5 rescued knights returned and became the core of the future order of the garden. The apple trees yielded their first full harvest, and Dan began breeding mana wheat. Master Geomancer Bom from the Silver Tree Academy arrived in the village, stunned that Dan had practically disproved all academic theories about the Black Scar. Bom spent 3 days in Iron Hill before she spoke to Dan normally for the first time. For the first 3 days, she ran around the garden with notebooks. She measured, she wrote things down, she sneezed from the dust, she tripped over the garden beds. Once, she fell into the compost pit, and Tim and Randy had to pull her out by the arms while she kept dictating the manaphone readings to herself. She was impossible, awkward, completely obsessed, and brilliant. On the 4th day, she came to Dan with her notebook open and said he was violating the laws of nature. Not just 1, 6. Dan asked her to list them. Bom listed them. First, a Scar-class mana toxin cannot be biologically neutralized. Dan neutralized it with mustard. Second, mana sources do not form in soil with organic matter below 5%. Dan's source appeared at 3.2%. Third, selecting rich crops requires at least 10 years and the participation of an A-rank geomancer. Dan did it in 6 months with a shovel. The 4th, 5th, and 6th were even more technical, and Dan understood about half of them. He listened, carefully. Then he asked Bomne if she knew what mycorrhiza was. Bomne fell. She looked at him. Then she admitted she didn't. Dan led her to the apple tree. He took out a trowel, carefully scooped the soil away from the roots. He showed her. Thin white threads ran through the soil around the root system. Mycelium, mycorrhizal fungi. They connected the apple tree's roots to the cabbage's roots, the cabbage roots with the mustard roots, the mustard with the lupine. Everything was connected. An underground network, a fungal internet. Dan explained. The mycelium distributes nutrients among the plants. It takes from those who have plenty, gives to those who have little. Moreover, it distributes mana. Mana rises from the source into the soil. The mycelium picks it up and carries it throughout the garden. Every plant receives its share, not randomly, evenly. Like an irrigation system, but for magical energy. Bomne listened without blinking. Then she sat down right on the ground. She took out a blank notebook, the fifth one, and began to write. She wrote for 2 hours without a break. Dan left to work. When he returned, she was sitting in the same spot. She had filled 30 pages. She looked up at him and said this was a revolution. That everything the Academy knew about the mana substrate needed to be rewritten from scratch. That mana wasn't a mineral, but a product of the ecosystem. That mages had spent 300 years searching for mana in stones when it was in worms. Dan nodded and said he was glad she understood. Then he asked if she could explain the theory of the mineral composition of the soil in the Shram region. Because the system was showing an anomalous concentration of an unknown element at a depth of 2 meters, and he didn't understand what it was. Bomne looked at him with the expression of someone who, for the first time in her life, had been asked not to stop talking, but to continue. She began to explain. Dan listened. He asked questions. Real questions, not condescending ones, not stupid ones. He wanted to know. He valued her intellect, not as a tool, as an equal. Bomne spoke faster and faster. She gestured with her hands. She sneezed twice and didn't notice. By evening, they were sitting by the mana spring and arguing about the mechanism of nutrient transport through the mycelium under conditions of residual toxicity. Evelyn brought them tea and silently set down 2 mugs. Then she left, and Dan didn't see the expression on her face. The next day, Bomne examined the deepest of the cleared areas, 2 meters down. Dan dug a test pit to check the soil. Bomne climbed down and placed her palms on the wall. Her eyes closed. Her face changed. When she climbed back up, her hands were shaking. She said there was a barrier down there, a magical one, very old, at least 200 years old, maybe older. It runs the entire length of the Black Scar at a depth of 10 to 15 meters. It's not a natural formation. It was put there, intentionally. Someone sealed off whatever lies below. Dan asked what lay below. Bomne said she didn't know, but the mana field beneath the barrier is 1,000 times stronger than on the surface. Something down there is emitting mana of such power that she hasn't encountered even in the Academy's vaults. Dan recalled the signal the system had been picking up since day 1, a warm pulse from the depths. He told Bomne. She wrote it down. Then she looked at him and said they needed to report this to the Academy. Dan said there was no need. Bomne opened her mouth to object. Dan said the Academy would send people. People would start digging. To dig means to destroy the garden. To destroy the garden means to kill the village. Besides, if the barrier was put up on purpose, then there was a reason for it. And breaking it just because it's interesting isn't science, it's foolishness. Bomne closed her mouth. She thought. Then she nodded, slowly. She said she wouldn't report it, for now, but that she wanted to stay and study the phenomenon on her own. Dan said he was glad, that she needed a seat at the communal table. Bomne sat down for dinner that evening between Nora and Una. Una slid a bowl of soup toward her. Bomne picked up a spoon and dropped it. Nora, Bomne thanked her and blushed. Seon sat across from her and looked at her with the expression of a wolf watching a rabbit. Not hostile, more puzzled. She later told Dan quietly that this girl had tripped 4 times that day and once nearly fell into a well. Dan replied that this girl had explained more about soil magic to him in a single evening than the system had in 6 months. Seon snorted. A week after Bomne's arrival, news came from Liam. A letter, short, dry. The Royal Chancellery had accepted the report. The decision regarding the Black Scar had been postponed until the next council meeting. Baron Drek had filed an official protest. He demanded that control over the transformed lands be transferred to the Drek domain.
Liam recommended accelerating negotiations with the guilds to establish a precedent for the use of the garden. If the garden were recognized a strategic facility for supplying armies fighting the Horde, the Baron will lose the legal basis for his claims. Between the lines, something else was implied. Hurry, the Baron won't wait for a trial. Dan showed the letter to Seon and Cullen. Seon said we need more people. Cullen said we need walls. Dan said we needed contracts. With the guilds. He sent the letters via Dorman. 6 letters to 6 hero guilds in the region. The proposal was simple. The Garden of Heroes provides wounded fighters with rest, medical care, and mana products. In exchange, the guilds would recognize the garden as neutral territory and pledge to defend it against encroachment. Not out of charity, out of self-interest. Endurance apples were as valuable as horses. Bread of Satiety could turn the tide of the campaign against the Horde. The news potion cured the Vorling poison. No guild in its right mind would let the Baron burn a source of such resources. Dorman left with the letters and a sly smile. The merchant sensed profit and made no secret of it. Dan didn't object. Dorman's greed was predictable, and predictability is almost 10. The replies began to arrive 3 weeks later. 4 out of 6 guilds agreed. 2 requested a trial shipment of goods. Dan sent each 5 apples and a sack of wheat. A week later, the remaining 2 signed as well. 6 guilds. The Garden of Heroes had become a reality. Not a dream, not a plan. A reality with seals and signatures. Baron Corvus Drek arrived at night, without warning, without a delegation, with 300 mercenaries. A guard in the watchtower spotted torches on the southern road an hour before dawn. He rang the bell. Ironhill awoke. Dan stood at the gate, watching the chain of lights approaching out of the darkness. 300, against 5 of Ivan's knights. Seon, Callan, and a dozen village men with pitchforks. The math was simple and hopeless. Seon stood beside him, sword on her back, her face calm. She said she would hold the gate for as long as she could. Dan said there was no need to hold the gate. Seon turned to him. Dan said he needed the night, one night, until dawn. He would work in the garden. Let them hold it, not the gate. Time. Seon looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she nodded. She didn't ask why. She trusted him. Dan ran toward the garden. Every step echoed in his head as a plan. The system was running at full capacity. Energy, 48 units. All he had. He hadn't been saving it on purpose. It was just that over the last few weeks, regeneration with 9 assistants had covered his expenses with a surplus. Now he would spend it all in a single night. The first thing he did was step outside the garden, into the land where the mercenaries would arrive. Black grass, thorns, mana toxin at 60%. The system highlighted the contours. Dan hadn't purified this land. On the contrary, he had enhanced it. 10 units of energy went into activating the mana toxin in the soil on the approaches to the garden. The ground became softer, wetter, blacker. The mercenaries' feet would sink ankle-deep, then knee-deep. Acidic mud would eat away at the skin through their fabric. Not fatal, but painful. And slow. Very slow. Second, the forest strip. The young trees he had planted 2 months ago, willows and oaks. The system had invested 15 units in accelerated growth. Overnight, the trees grew a meter taller. The canopies closed in. The brush between the trunks became an impassable wall. Not a fortress, but enough to stop cavalry. Foot soldiers will get through, but slowly, one at a time, between the branches. An ideal defensive position. Third, sunflowers. Dan had planted a 20-meter-wide strip in front of the forest edge. Sunflowers, the ones that draw moisture from the soil,
15 of them. The system had pushed their growth to the limit. By dawn, the field of sunflowers stood at full height, 2 meters tall, dense as a wall, and every flower drew water from the ground beneath it. The earth dried out, cracked, became hard as stone. Sounds good, but the trick was elsewhere. The moisture went down into the layer of mana toxin. The toxin dissolved and rose upward in the form of fog, thick, acrid fog. Not deadly, but blinding. People in the fog can't see past their outstretched hand. Their eyes water, their throats burn, they lose their bearings. Soldiers accustomed to formation scatter in the fog like children in the woods. Fourth, Bran's traps. Iron snares, 30 of them. The blacksmith forged them for 3 weeks. Callan and Ivan set them up in the clearings between the trees. They camouflaged them with branches and mud. A mercenary walking alone in the fog between the trees won't see the trap until he steps on it. Dan has 8 energy points left. He spent his last ones on one thing. He stood in the center of the garden. He placed his palms on the ground by the mana source, and he asked, not the system, the earth, the one beneath him, the one that responded every time he planted a new seed. He asked for help, not with words, not with thoughts, with his hands. He pressed his palms against the warm, living soil and simply was a farmer on his land. The system flickered. Request accepted. Deep mana support activated. Nature of support unknown. Dan didn't understand what that meant, but he felt the warmth from beneath the ground intensify. He felt the pulse grow louder. He felt as if the entire garden had sighed. Dawn. Baron Dreok's mercenaries approached the garden from the south and west. 3 columns, cavalry in front, infantry behind. The Baron himself on a white horse behind the ranks, elegant even in the pre-dawn gloom. A cloak with a golden hawk, a sword at his belt, his face calm. For him, this was not a battle, a punitive operation. Crush the village, burn the garden, take the farmer away in chains. The cavalry entered the sunflower field and stopped. The stalks were as thick as bamboo. The horses couldn't get through. The riders dismounted. They walked on foot. After 10 steps, the fog began, acrid, gray, smelling of sulfur and rusty iron. The mercenaries' eyes watered. The formation broke. People began coughing and rubbing their faces. Sergeants shouted to hold the line. No one heard. The fog swallowed the sounds. The first wave reached the tree line. The mercenaries crawled between the trees, 1 by 1, 2 by 2. The traps snapped shut. Screams, curses, moans. 15 men were taken out in the first 10 minutes. Not dead, maimed. Which, in a way, is worse. A wounded man screams. A wounded man must be dragged. A wounded man demoralizes. Baron Drek led 300 mercenaries to Iron Hill. Dan spent the night in the garden setting up a defense system of sunflowers, fog generators, an accelerated forest strip, and traps. The mercenaries got bogged down in the fog and traps even before the real battle began. Those who made it through the forest belt emerged into the open space of the garden. They were met by Seon. The B-rank swordswoman stood in the middle of a row of apple trees, a 2-handed sword in her hands. Her braid was slung over her shoulder, a scar on her eyebrow. Her face expressionless. She didn't make speeches. She didn't warn them. The first mercenary emerged from the fog, and a second later was lying on the ground. Seon's sword moved so fast that Dan, standing 30 meters away, saw only a flash. She wasn't killing them. She was striking the helmets with the flat of the blade. At the quiff, on the shins, on the knees, every blow precise and measured. The mercenaries fell like sheaves of wheat, one after another.
Those who saw this from the fog turned around and retreated. Cullen held the western passage. Silently, methodically, one-eyed, but every blow of the axe landed where it was meant to. The butt against shields, against shoulders, the shaft under knees. He worked like a butcher in a slaughterhouse, without malice, without haste. Just work. Ivan and his four held the northern sector. Young, but angry, and motivated. They were defending their home, not Iron Hill, the orchard, the place where they'd been fed when they'd lost, the place where the apples smelled of honey and the morning began with warm bread. They fought as if the whole world stood behind them. The village men stood on the palisade walls. Bran was among them, a hammer in his hands. Tim and Randy were nearby with their bows. They weren't good shots, but from that distance it was hard to miss. The mercenaries kept coming. The fog thinned as they approached the garden, but the ground beneath their feet worked against them. Where Dan had activated the toxin, the soil was like a swamp. Their boots sank in. People fell. They got up. They fell again. Their armor was covered in black, acidic mud. The skin beneath their straps burned. Morale dropped with every passing minute. 300 mercenaries is a serious force. Against a village, it's an army. But an army fights in formation, by orders, by discipline. In the fog, among the trees, knee-deep in mud, there was no formation. There was a mob, an angry, lost, and frightened one. By mid-morning, half the mercenaries had retreated behind the sunflower field. A third were wounded or shell-shocked. The rest huddled at the edge of the forest strip, not daring to enter again. Baron Drek stood on a rise behind the line of sunflowers. His face had changed. His elegant confidence was gone. Something dark and evil had taken its place. He shouted at the sergeants to set the sunflowers ablaze. Torches flew into the field. The stalks caught fire. The flames crept through the rows. The smoke mingled with the fog, and it became impossible to breathe. But the sunflowers were damp. Full of moisture they had drawn from the soil all night. They burned slowly. They smoked terribly. But they did not produce an open flame. The fire did not spread to the garden. The damp, living soil did not burn. Dan stood in the center of the garden by the mana spring, his hands in the ground, his eyes closed. The system showed 0 units of energy. But the warmth from the depths did not cease. A response, deep support. He did not understand the mechanics, but he felt that the earth was helping. The roots of the trees in the forest belt held the soil in place. They prevented the mercenaries from cutting their way through. Every branch chopped down by an axe grew back, not instantly, but faster than it should have. The mycelium underground redirected mana from the source to the damaged areas. The garden was healing itself. Not because it was a magical artifact, but because it was a living ecosystem. Ecosystems don't give up. They adapt. By noon, the fighting had died down. The mercenaries had retreated. The wounded were being dragged out to the road. The smoke from the sunflowers was dissipating. Baron Drek sat on his horse and looked at the garden. At the green patch his army had failed to take. At the village behind the stockade that hadn't surrendered. At the farmer standing among the apple trees with dirty hands and a calm face. Then something happened that no one expected. Riders appeared on the road from the north. Many, no fewer than 100. Banners, the royal coat of arms, and at the front, on a black horse, a man in black gloves. Liam Chue. Riding with him were the royal archers, 100 of them. With the Crown Council's decree granting Blackscar the status of a strategic territory under the direct jurisdiction of the Crown, which meant one simple thing.
Baron Drek had just attacked Crown land with 300 mercenaries without permission. Treason. Liam stopped his horse in front of the Baron. He held out the sealed document. The Baron read it for a long time. His face shifted from anger to pallor, and from pallor to the gray of a man who realizes he has lost. Not the battle. Everything. Liam said quietly that the Baron could surrender voluntarily, or not voluntarily. The result would be the same. Baron Corvas Drek dropped his sword to the ground. His mercenaries followed suit. The clang of metal against stone was prolonged. 300 swords, axes, and spears lay on the road. Dan stood at the edge of the garden and watched as the Baron was led away in chains. An elegant, cruel Baron, convinced of his own righteousness,
A man who believed that land was a right of blood. He was not a great villain. He was a product of the system, a system in which land is acquired, not made. Seon approached from behind, a sword at her back, a stranger's blood on her cheek. Her hands trembled with exhaustion. She said the apple trees were intact, not a single one was broken. Dan nodded. He looked at the garden. The sunflower field was blackened by fire. The tree line was battered. The garden beds on the western edge were trampled, but the center stood. The apple trees stood. The spring glimmered. The earth was warm. It can be restored. It can be replanted. It can be grown anew. That, after all, is the essence. The earth does not die as long as there is someone willing to work. Baron Drek's mercenaries were bogged down defending the garden and could not take it. Liam Cho brought in the royal archers with a decree on the strategic status of the scar. Baron Drek was arrested for attacking Crown territory. The garden survived, though it sustained damage. The restoration took a month. Dan worked every day. He replanted, he watered, weeded. The garden beds on the western edge had been completely destroyed. He replanted them. He pruned the tree line and gave it direction for new growth. He cleared the sunflower field. The burnt stalks were turned into biochar, light black charcoal made from plants, the best fertilizer possible. Dan ground it up and worked it into the soil of the new plots. From the ashes of defeat grew the fertilizer for victory. He would have appreciated the irony if he hadn't been too exhausted to think about irony. Madison Rice showed up 2 weeks after the battle, a tall redhead with a lazy smile and eyes that looked at the world as if they had long since stopped expecting anything good from it. A former scout and tracker, a mercenary. She came on the recommendation of one of the guilds that had signed the contract. She was supposed to become the head of security for the garden. She walked the perimeter in 2 hours. She surveyed the forest strip. She checked the approaches. She found 3 places through which one could pass unnoticed. Cullen hadn't found a single one. Maddie was better. She set up observation posts. She organized patrols of Ivan's knights and village volunteers. She drew up an evacuation plan in case of an attack. She worked quickly and without unnecessary words. Dan noticed that she didn't enter the garden. She stands at the edge. She watches. But she doesn't go in. On the 3rd day, he asked why. Maddie shrugged and said it wasn't her place, that she was a soldier, not a farmer, that beautiful things weren't for her. Dan didn't argue. He got up early in the morning, and by the time Maddie arrived for her shift, a small table was set up at the entrance to the garden. On the table was a plate. On the plate was fresh mana-wheat bread with butter and an apple, and a mug of tea. Maddie looked at the table, at the plate, at Dan standing 10 paces away with a shovel. He wasn't looking at her. He was digging. Maddie sat down at the table. She picked up the bread, took a bite, chewed slowly.
Then she sat for a long time with her mug of tea. When she stood up, her eyes were red. She didn't say anything, but that evening she went into the garden for the first time. She walked between the garden beds. She stopped by the apple tree. She stood and looked at the small green fruits. Then she sat down on the ground right under the tree and sat there for an hour. Dan saw her from the hayloft window. He didn't go over. There are people who can only warm themselves up when they're alone. Maddie was one of those people. The next morning, the table was at the entrance again, and the next, and the next. After a week, Maddie stopped asking why. She just came and ate. Then she went on patrol. Then she came back and sat under the apple tree. Sometimes Seon sat next to her, in silence. Two women who had fought their whole lives and weren't used to silence. They were learning to sit. At the same time, another event took place. Yuna was revealed. Not by her own doing. She was recognized. One of Ivan's knights, a guy named Mark, had previously served in the garrison of the city of Altamar, Baron Drek's domain. He had seen a portrait in the Baron's house. Yuna, Han Yujin, the youngest daughter of Lord Han from the neighboring domain. Baron Drek's fiancée. A runaway bride. Mark told Ivan. Ivan told Dan. Dan said nothing. Then he went to Evelyn's house. Yuna was sitting on the porch, peeling carrots. Hands that 6 months ago couldn't even hold a scoop now deftly handled a knife. Calluses on her palms, a tan on her face. She had changed. Dan sat down beside her.
Yuna looked at him and understood from his expression. The knife froze in her hand. She turned pale. Dan said he knew who she was, that he'd known for a long time, from her posture, from her speech, from the dress she'd come in, and from the way she'd hidden when Kaslik arrived with the Baron's coat of arms. Yuna was silent. Her hands trembled. The carrot fell into the mud. Dan said she was in no danger, that the Baron was in chains, and the engagement meant nothing, that she could remain Yuna, or become Eugene, as she wished. Yuna picked up the carrot. She wiped it on her apron. She looked at her hands, at the calluses, at the dirt under her nails. Then she said quietly that she wanted to stay. Not as Yuna, as Eugene, but to stay. Here, in Iron Hill. Because here, for the first time in her life, she was valued not for her surname, but for her ability to plant strawberries. Dan nodded. A week later, Eugene sent a letter to her father. By herself, without intermediaries. She wrote that she was alive, that the engagement was off, that she was staying in Iron Hill of her own free will. She signed her full name, Han Eugene, with her chin held high. Lord Han's reply came a month later. One line, "Be happy." Eugene read that line standing in the middle of the strawberry patch. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Nora stood beside her, holding her hand. The year was drawing to a close. The garden now covered 10 hectares. 10 hectares of living earth on the site of a 200-year-old curse. The first real grove. Apple trees, oaks, willows, birch-like trees. Real trees. Healthy. With birds in their crowns, with mushrooms at their roots, with moss on their trunks. There were now 12 mana sources. Total output, 2.4 units per day. Growth was exponential. Each new hectare of living earth generated mana faster than the one before it. The mycelium was expanding its network. The worms were multiplying. The ecosystem was gaining mass and speed. Balmne filled 14 notebooks. She compiled the first description in Illyria's history of mana generation through biological systems. She called it biomantry, a new science, born not in the Academy's laboratory, in the dirt, under a farmer's fingernails.
Dan stood at the edge of the garden in the evening and looked at the grove. The trees rustled in the wind. The leaves rustled. A bird sang somewhere. The first bird on the black scar in 200 years. He closed his eyes and heard. Not a bird, not the wind. A voice. Quiet, deep, coming from beneath the earth. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Someone down there was saying thank you. Someone down there was waiting. A second year had passed. The garden covered the perimeter of Black Scar almost completely, a green ring around a black center, like a bandage around a wound. Dan stood on the Dawn Hill west of Iron Hill and looked at what he had built. 20 hectares, groves, fields, gardens, 3 ponds dug by hand and stocked with fish from the stream. Wooded strips that had turned into veritable walls of living trees. 4 training glades for the guilds. Evelyn's clinic with its own garden of 30 varieties of medicinal herbs. Bran's forge, fueled by charcoal from trees grown in healthy soil. The charcoal burned so hot that Bran began to forge steel that city craftsmen envied. 200 people lived in Iron Hill now. Not 100. 200. New houses, new families, a carpenter's workshop, a bakery, a small school where Bomne taught children to read and count, and all the while she kept sneezing from the chalk. The Order of the Garden numbered 20 knights. Ivan commanded them. Not a brilliant commander, quiet, reliable, one of those who doesn't give speeches but whom men would follow into the fire. His knights wore green cloaks embroidered with an apple, not a lion, not an eagle, not a dragon, an apple. And this apple was feared more than many dragons. 6 guilds became 12. Contracts grew. Apples of endurance, bread of satiety, cabbage against poison, grapes that purify the blood. A new variety that Dan had bred 2 months ago. Mana saturation, 20 units. 3 groots of the effects of monotoxin poisoning. For the heroes fighting on the border of the Horde of Rot, it was equivalent to an elixir of immortality. Liam came every month. He brought news from the capital, decrees, documents, protection. He became the garden's voice at court. He shielded Dan from officials, mages, and aristocrats who reached for what they didn't understand. He paid for it with his reputation, with rumors, with sidelong glances. They called him a traitor to his class. He didn't object. He simply put on his gloves and rode back to Iron Hill, where, at the common table, a chair awaited him. And a plate. And people who didn't ask who his father was. This morning was different. Dan felt it the moment he opened his eyes. The air was different. The earth pulsed, not quiet as usual, loud, insistent. The system activated without a request. Full diagnostics. Abnormal mana activity along the entire perimeter of the scar. Deep resonance. Power at 400% of normal. Recommendation: immediate inspection of the central zone. The central zone. The heart of the Black Scar. The only place Dan hadn't touched. 2 kilometers from the edge of the garden. The most toxic spot. Monotoxin at 95%. Nothing grew there, not even black grass. Just bare black earth and a silence so deep it made your ears ring. Dan came down from the hayloft. Evelyn was already awake. She was standing by the front garden, looking at the lavender. The bushes were trembling, slightly, as if from an underground tremor. But the ground wasn't shaking. Only the plants were trembling, all at once, as if something had passed through the roots from the bottom up and every stem had responded. Evelyn turned to him. There was a question in her eyes. Dan said he needed to go to the center of the scar. Evelyn didn't ask why. She nodded and went into the house. A minute later, she returned with a bag, bandages, decoctions, burn ointment, a flask of water, Mana wheat crackers. She gathered everything that might be needed. Because she knew. Because over the past 2 years, she had learned to read the expression on his face. It was the face of a man who was going to a place from which he might not return. Dan gathered everyone. Seon was the first to arrive, sword on her back, her braid tied with a leather cord, her eyes clear. She didn't ask where, she just went. Maddie arrived fully armed, 2 blades, light chainmail, a map of the area in her breast pocket. She'd managed to scout the approaches to the center of the scar a month ago, just in case. Maddie was always prepared, just in case. Cullen stood next to Seon, silent, an axe on his shoulder, one eye watching for both of them. Bomne ran up with 4 notebooks and a stopwatch. Her glasses sat crookedly on her nose. She sneezed 3 times while buttoning her jacket. Then she pulled a 5th notebook from behind her belt and began recording the mana before they even left the village. Liam had arrived the night before. He stood at the gate. His gloves were off, both of them, for the first time in front of everyone. His hands, with scars on the knuckles, hung loosely at his sides. He looked at Dan and said he was going with him, not as an inspector, as a friend. Ivan lined up 2 knights at the entrance to the garden. The rest remained on the walls, guarding the perimeter, just in case something happened. No one knew exactly what, but everyone sensed it. Nora stood at the garden gate. Dan told her to stay. She looked straight at him, without fear, without resentment. She nodded. Then she quietly told him to come back, because on the western edge, it was time to transplant the seedlings, and without him, she didn't know which variety to put in the 3rd bed. Dan smiled slightly. Eugene stood next to Nora. Her hands were muddy from weeding that morning. She hadn't asked to come. She knew her place, here, in the garden, among the strawberries she'd planted herself. She squeezed Nora's hand and nodded to Dan. Tim and Randy approached with buckets. They didn't know why they needed buckets, but they were used to the fact that if Dan was going somewhere, buckets were needed, or shovels, or manure, or all of it at once. Dan said the buckets weren't needed. The guys exchanged glances, shrugged, set down the buckets, stayed. They left the garden and entered the scar. The greenery had ended. The black world began. But it was different now. Dan could feel the difference in his skin. 2 years ago, the scar was dead. Now it was tense, like a string just before it snaps, or just before it sounds. The air hummed, inaudibly, at the level of vibration. The ground beneath their feet was warm even through the soles of their boots. An hour later, they reached the center and stopped. A circle, perfectly even, 20 meters in diameter. It hadn't been there a month ago. Maddie had checked. It had appeared on its own. The ground inside the circle wasn't black, dark brown, almost normal, as if someone had cleared it from below, pushed the poison upward, and restored what had been there. At the edges of the circle, the mana toxin had formed a black crust, like slag on the surface of a melt. The earth had expelled it, got rid of it, all on its own. The system flashed. The barrier is thinning. Distance to the deep-seated object, 10 meters. Object active. Mana level critical. Recommendation, contact. Bomne stood nearby recording the readings. Her hands were shaking. Her glasses were fogged up. She whispered that the mana level here was 1,000 times higher than in the Academy's vaults, that no device was designed for such readings, that she could physically feel the pressure of mana on her skin, as if standing under a waterfall, only the water was warm and smelled of spring. Liam approached the edge of the circle. He placed his palm on the ground. He pulled it back. He looked at his hand, then at Dan. He said the earth was singing. Not quietly like before, loudly, like a choir. Seon stood with her sword at the ready, but the sword was trembling, not from fear, from the vibration. The metal was responding to the mana in the air. The blade hummed. Seon looked at him in surprise. In the 10 years she'd owned that sword, she'd never heard anything like it. Maddie circled around. She checked the approaches, a professional reflex. Then she stopped and just stood there. Because there was nothing to check. There was no threat. There was an invitation. Dan took off his gloves. He looked at his hands. Calluses, scars, dirt under his fingernails. Hands that hadn't known rest for 2 years. Hands that remembered every clod of earth, every root, every seed. Hands that had tried to fix a tractor on a hillside in Oregon and hadn't made it in time. Hands that had been given a second chance in a world where no one believed they could do anything important. He knelt down at the edge of the circle. He placed his palms on the ground inside. Warm, alive, pulsing, like the chest of a sleeping creature. Like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient and patient. The system ramped up to full power. Every line burned brighter than ever. Contact established. Deep-level object identified. Garden of the First God. Status: Awakening. Stage: Final. Request from object. Permission to contact. Yes or no. Dan closed his eyes. He said yes. Not to the system, to the earth. It grew hot beneath his palms, then very hot, then warm. Not scorching. Homey. Like a stove on a cold evening. Like a mug of tea in chilled hands. Like the earth in a greenhouse in early spring, when everything is ready to grow but is still waiting. And he heard a voice. Not in his head, in his hands. In his bones, in his joints, which ached from 2 years of non-stop work. In the muscles of his back, which had forgotten what rest was. The voice traveled through the earth, through the roots, through the mycelium that enveloped the entire scar deep below, through the mana sources that pulsed like tiny hearts. The voice traveled through everything Dan had grown over these 2 years, through every sprout, through every tree, through every worm. An ancient voice, older than this world, older than stones and rivers, older than the sky. The voice spoke in a language Dan did not know. No scholar could translate it, no mage could reproduce it. But Dan understood every word. Just as he understood when the soil was too acidic, when the roots lacked water, when a plant was cold. Not with his mind, with his hands. The voice spoke. I have waited for you a long time. 200 years. Every day I listened to the earth above, listened to it dying, to the black grass devouring what I had planted, to thorns sprouting through what used to be a garden. Every day I hoped. Every day, silence. Then you came. I heard you rub a clump of earth between your fingers. I felt you lick the soil in the communal garden, and the whole village froze in horror. I laughed. For the first time in 200 years. Because only those who truly love the earth do that. I planted a seed in another world. Far away. Very far away. The seed sprouted in you, not in magic, not in class, not in the system, in your hands, in your habits, in the way you lift a shovel, in the way you look at the garden bed, in the way you think of Grandma Martha instead of world domination. You came. You worked. You didn't ask for power. You didn't ask for authority. You didn't ask for armies and gold and eternal life. You asked only that the earth might live. I remember that. The world remembers that. The earth remembers that. You did not come to rule. You came to plant. Dan listened. Tears streamed down his cheeks and dripped into the ground. He didn't wipe them away. The earth absorbed them. Every drop went down, to the roots, to the mycelium, to the garden that had waited 200 years. The voice continued.
I was a gardener, the first. I planted this world. Every tree, from the northern conifers to the southern palms, every bush, every blade of grass. I knelt in the mud and planted, just like you, with the same hands, with the same calluses. Then they decided that the earth was property, that it could be divided into starry fields and gray lands, that some have a right to fertility and others to dust, that mana must be sought in crystals and not in earthworms, that a farmer's work is menial labor and not the foundation of everything. I argued. I said that the earth knows no boundaries, that any soil can become a garden if given time and care and hands that are not lazy. They did not listen. They called me the fallen one. They sealed me away along with my garden. They called a curse what was a blessing. The black scar is not a wound. It is a lid. Placed over what they were afraid to admit was the truth. I waited. Not for a hero. Many heroes came. They cut through thorns with swords. They burned the black grass with spells. They tried to break through the crust with force. They left with nothing. Because the scar doesn't need to be defeated. It needs to be healed. I wasn't waiting for a mage. Mages came too. They analyzed, they theorized, they wrote dissertations. They left with the conclusion that it was impossible, because they didn't think to get down on their knees and feel it. I was waiting for a farmer, someone who understands that the earth isn't a tool. The earth is a home. Someone who isn't afraid of dirt under their fingernails. Someone who starts not with a grand plan, but with a single garden bed for an old woman with aching joints. The voice fell silent. Silence. Long, deep. The silence of the earth that has spoken and is waiting for an answer. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at his hands on the ground, at the dark, warm soil, at his people standing behind him. Evelyn, Seon, Maddie, Liam, Bomne, Cullen, Ivan. Everyone was silent. Everyone heard, not words, a vibration, warmth, meaning, each in their own language. Evelyn heard her husband's voice saying that everything would be all right. Seon heard the silence of a shelter where there was no longer any cold. Maddie heard that something could be saved. Liam heard, "You have a right to a place." Bomne heard the answer to all the questions she had asked since childhood. The earth of the circle parted. Slowly, without a rumble, without an earthquake. The soil simply moved aside as water parts before a stone. Gently, naturally, as if the earth had always wanted to do this and had finally been given permission. Below, a light appeared. Green, soft, warm. The light came from the depths, from roots that extended dozens of meters downward. They were white and thick as ropes. Every root pulsed. Mana flowed through them like blood through veins. From the mycelium that encompassed the entire space beneath the scar, millions of thin threads, a living network, sleeping for 200 years and waking now. Each thread lit up in turn, like lights on a night road, one after another, from the center to the edges. The garden of the first god. Not ruins, not a skeleton. A living garden. Vast, ancient, waiting. Every plant in it was primordial, the one from which all the trees and grasses and flowers of this world originated. The progenitors, the seeds of seeds, the roots of roots.
Light rose from beneath the earth and spread across the scar. A green wave. Slow, majestic, unstoppable. It moved from the center to the edges. The black earth changed in its path. The black grass paled, turned gray, turned green. Leaves unfurled. Real ones, soft, alive. Thorns crumbled to dust. The 200-year-old crust cracked and flaked away. Sprouts rose from beneath it. Thousands of sprouts, tens of thousands. Green dots on a black field. Then green stripes. Then a green sea. The acid fog melted away, dissipated. In its place, a scent rose. Earth. Fresh, damp, fertile earth. The scent after rain. The scent of spring. The scent of a new beginning. Bomna fell to her knees beside Dan. The notebook fell from her hands. She watched the green wave receding toward the horizon and wept. Openly, unashamedly. 300 years of evidence of impossibility crumbled before her eyes. Everything she had taught, everything she had proven, everything she had defended in academic debates, all of it was a lie. The truth lay in the mud beneath the farmer's knees. Scion stood with her sword at the ready. Then she slowly lowered it. The blade stopped humming. It sang, quietly, melodiously, like a tuning fork attuned to the frequency of the living world. Scion thrust the sword into the ground. For the first time in 10 years, she let it go.
Because there was nothing left to cut down, nothing to defend. There was no need.
She sat down on the ground next to the sword. She drew her knees up. She wrapped her arms around herself. And she allowed herself not to be a warrior. Just a human being on the warm, living earth. Maddie took off her boots, slowly. She untied them. She pulled them off. She placed her bare feet on the warm soil. Her toes sank into the soft earth. She closed her eyes. Her face bore an expression Dan had never seen in all the time he'd known her. Peace. Maddie, who had spent 5 years clearing out hopeless villages, who had been told nothing could be saved, who had stopped believing, stood barefoot on the earth that was coming back to life, and believed. Finally believed. Liam stood upright. His hands were bare, scars on his knuckles. He looked at the green wave receding toward the horizon, at the light from the depths, at the world that was changing right now. Then he lowered his gaze to his feet, to the ground beneath them. This land wasn't lent to him. It wasn't leased. It didn't belong to the crown or a baron or some noble house. It simply was. And he simply stood upon it.
And he had the right to do so. Not by birth, not by document.
Because he was here. Because he had come and stayed. Because he had taken off his gloves. Cullen stood on the flank, his axe lowered, his one eye gazed at the green wave. Then he did something he had never done before. He sat down. He simply sat down on the ground. He placed his axe beside him, and he sat there, silently. A big, quiet, one-eyed man on the green earth. Evelyn approached Dan from behind, quietly, so quietly that he didn't hear her footsteps. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He felt her palm, cracked, warm, smelling of lavender and healing herbs. A hand that had healed others for 5 years, but couldn't heal itself. A hand that had learned once again to believe that hands can do more than just lose. Dan covered her hand with his. Dirty fingers over cracked ones. 2 people who had lost everything. He, his life. She, her family. And they found each other on the edge of a dead land that turned out not to be dead. The green wave rolled on, kilometer after kilometer. Black Scar was surrendering. Not with a crash, not with an explosion. Quietly, like night yields to dawn. Gradually, inevitable, naturally. A voice from the depths asked. The final question. Simple, the main one. What do you want to do with the world that is now yours? Everyone heard it. Not the words, the question. It passed through the earth and rose through their legs, through their spines, through their chests. Everyone heard it in their own language. Everyone froze. Dan answered aloud. His voice was hoarse from tears and exhaustion. An ordinary voice, not heroic, not thunderous. The voice of a man who hasn't slept in 2 years, because there's always one more garden bed that needs watering. He said the world isn't his, that the world belongs to no one, that the earth doesn't belong to the one who stands upon it, doesn't belong to the one who conquered it. It doesn't belong to the one born in the right house with the right surname. The earth belongs to the one who loves it, to the one who gets up at dawn and picks up a shovel, to the one who doesn't turn his nose up at manure and isn't shy of dirt, to the one who plants a tree knowing that its shade won't fall on him, but on his children. He said he doesn't want the world, doesn't want power. He doesn't want to be a king or a god or a hero. There are already heroes. They're standing over there with swords and axes, with notebooks and gloves, with cracked hands and bare feet on the warm earth. They are heroes. He is not. He wants every Granny Martha to have her cabbage, for every boy who lost his first fight to have a bowl of soup and a hand on his shoulder, for every woman who lost her family to have lavender in her front garden, for every girl sold like a commodity to have her own strawberry patch and the right to say no, for every scientist to have someone who listens without condescension, for every soldier to have a place where he can take off his boots and set his bare feet on living earth, for every scrap of cursed land to know that it is not a sentence, not a punishment, not the wrath of ancient gods, just soil that needs someone is ready to work. The voice was silent for a long time. The silence was not empty. It was full, like the silence between the last clap of thunder and the first drop of rain, like the silence of a seed in the ground a second before it cracks open and sends out a root. Then Dan felt the earth beneath his palms smile, not with words, not with sound, with warmth, a deep, calm warmth that rose from beneath the scar and spread throughout his body, through his hands, through his shoulders, through his back, which had ached for 2 years without a break, and suddenly stopped, through his knees, through his feet, through him into Evelyn standing behind his shoulder, through the earth into everyone standing nearby. The warmth flowed like water. No, like sap through a tree trunk. From the bottom up, from the roots to the crowns. Naturally. The light from the depths grew brighter, then softer. Then it became part of the earth. Not a separate glow, just the earth grew warmer, more alive, greener, as if someone had added brightness, not to the colors, to the world. Sprouts were rising all around. The grass was turning green. A bird came down from somewhere above and landed on a thorn. The thorn crumbled beneath its feet. The bird flew over to a sprout. The sprout held firm. A small yellow bird on a green sprout in the middle of the former black scar. Bomne saw it and began to write and cry at the same time. The notes were wet with tears and illegible, but she didn't stop. On the horizon, the black strip of the scar was narrowing, melting away.
The greenery was advancing, slowly but unstoppably. Somewhere far to the west, the edge of the scar reached the border of the neighboring domain, and a green wave surged over the invisible line. The gray earth of the common folk trembled and became a little better, slightly more fertile, slightly kinder. The aristocrats' starfields flickered and grew quiet. They did not go out. They simply became slightly less exceptional. The world was evening out. It wasn't collapsing. It wasn't turning upside down. It was simply, quietly, justly, and inevitably evening out. Somewhere far to the north, in the horde of rot, something ancient and hungry raised its head. It sensed that the world had changed, but the land it had been devouring for 200 years had begun to resist. It began to live. It began to push the rot out of its pores, just as a healthy body pushes out a splinter. And for the first time in 200 years, this ancient creature felt fear. Not of the sword, not of magic, of a green sprout, of the warm earth, of a farmer on his knees with dirty hands. But that was another story, for another day, for other chapters that someone else would write. Or perhaps that same farmer, when he rested, if he rested. Now it was dawn, the first real dawn over the black scar in 200 years. The sun was rising over a green field, not gray, not leaden, real, golden and warm. And it warmed. It truly warmed. So the faces of the people standing in that field warmed from the light, and from another kind of warmth, one that came from within. Dan Holt sat on the ground that was no longer cursed, his hands in the earth, tears on his cheeks, a smile on his split lip, which had never fully healed after the battle. Standing around him were people who had believed in him when there was nothing else to believe in. The swordswoman who stayed for a warm apple and never left. The herbalist who planted lavender on the grave of the past and let in the new. The girl who came with white hands and left with calluses and her chin held high. The scholar who shattered 300 years of delusion with 5 notebooks wet with tears. The soldier who took off her boots and stood barefoot on that she had stopped believing in, and it grew. The inspector who took off his gloves and found a home at a stranger's table. The blacksmith who silently hung horseshoes above a stranger's door and once brought a shovel instead of a horseshoe. 5 boys who became knights not because they took an oath, but because once someone poured them soup when they lost. 3 freckled helpers with buckets that no one had asked for. A village that stopped considering itself cursed. A world that began to understand that land isn't given, but made. Dan stood up, slowly. His knees creaked. His back ached. His hands were elbow-deep in the dirt. He brushed them off on his pants. He looked at the field. A new green field where a 200-year-old wasteland had once been. Huge. Endless. Beautiful. And completely empty. Not a single garden bed. Not a single row, not a single sapling. Just earth, fresh, ready, waiting. He turned to the others, to Evelyn with her calm eyes, to Seon with his sword stuck in the ground, to Maddie standing barefoot, to Liam without gloves, to Bomne with her wet notebooks, to Cullen sitting on the ground, to Ivan standing at attention with his hand over his heart. They were looking at him, waiting, not for an order, not for a speech, not a prophecy. Dan smiled. The familiar, crooked smile of a farmer who sees a lot of work ahead of him and little time. He rolled up his sleeves to his elbows, just as he had done every morning for the past 2 years,
just as he had done on the farm in Oregon, just as he would do tomorrow and the day after and in a year and in 10 years.